Blacksmith of the Apocalypse by Arcuser. Chapter 641 Reiki in Love. Reiki was a young man when he fell in love at first sight. The girl he fell in love with was Love, the wise. She was no older than him, but her wisdom had already helped their village since she was a child. Reiki was not as wise as her. Nor was he strong like the warriors of the village, but he had a good head and a pleasant voice. To match Love he became a skald and learned the songs and sagas of their people. He courted her and she didn't seem opposed. They got her father's permission and married. However, their life together was not long, as the village elder wanted to go on a journey with Love. She was already wise from a young age, but it was necessary to see the world if she was going to be his successor. The young couple was separated. As Reiki did his best to become a great skald while longing for his wife, the stories of her deeds in the world kept coming back. Love used her knowledge and wisdom to help the villages on their way, making a name for herself. Years went by. While Reiki was now known as a great skald far and wide, the stories of Love had fallen silent. He had done his best to build a house fit for them and amass a fortune so they would never have to worry about money when she finally returned. After 5 years of waiting, Reiki set off on a journey. There had been no news of his wife and the elder for months. No stories, no letters, nothing. He was worried something had happened. Reiki knew their stories well. He was a great skald. He followed the traces of their journey, based on the stories, news, and songs written. Love, the wise, had saved villages from famine, drought, and sickness. In every town and village she helped, he found pictures of her likeness as the savior of the place. Every time she saw a picture or a statue of his wife, his longing grew. He followed the trail of tales until he reached the last village, where he was able to find information on their next destination. His journey had taken almost half a year when he finally reached the last place the elder and Love had been seen. The forests he crossed on his way were sick and dying. A rancid smell was poisoning the air and the creeks he came past were murky. Allegedly a hydra had taken home not far away and the village suffered from the poison. He felt sick, just smelling the air. Worry gripped his heart at the thought that Love may have died in this place. However, it broke when he found the truth from the villagers. His wise wife and the elder had gone to negotiate with the reptile, only to come back heavily wounded. While the elder died from the wounds and the poison, the villagers told him that Love and the doctor that nursed her fell in love and fled together. The great skald Reiki fell into an abyss. The love of his life, he had waited for so long for, had found a lover and ran away. All he wanted was to stay in the tavern all day long and drink to forget, but the time wasn't given to him. Mere days after his arrival, the beast attacked the village. Bitter and hopeless, he saw no reason not to jump into battle. He was still a great skald, this was no empty title. Where no quick wit and strong arm succeeded, the skald managed to lull the beast into a deep sleep before stabbing his dagger into its heart, ending its life. The skald had slain the dragon, but the price was high as he suffered the concentrated poison of the beast. His life was in peril and his body just mirrored the state of his mind, mostly broken. It was almost comical how one suffering could help cope with another. His bodily pains only made him realize how much he wanted to live, even with a broken heart. With the little time he had left, he started searching for a cure. Reiki managed to find one. The world was vast and his life short, but in the end someone approached him with a way to survive. The heart elixir will guarantee you 6 months. At this time it will judge you. If your heart is pure you will survive, if it isn't you had 6 months to find your peace, the mysterious figure had explained. The great skald exchanged all the fortune he had collected for the elixir, leaving him with nothing to his name, except his reputation and skills. Upon drinking the elixir he could feel its power coursing through his body and cleansing away the poison. In exchange, a small heart-shaped mark appeared on his chest. 3 quarters were dark, while 1 quarter was pale. Reiki didn't expect to have a pure heart. It was filled with bitterness, nurtured by the weeks of suffering. He had blamed Love for every painful breath and every stinging movement. 6 months. He could have looked for his unfaithful wife, but he didn't. 6 months were just enough to make it back home and maybe say his farewells to the people that were there for him. When he decided not to chase her, the mark on his chest became a little lighter. Freed from the poison's pain, he followed his footsteps back home. With every month that passed and every village, he came through his bitterness melted away a little. Seeing the pictures and stature of Love stung at first, but he also came to a realization. Looking at her face carved from stone, he realized that all this time, he had been chasing a literal ghost. Love meant wind in their language, but also ghost. He had tried to grasp something that was not there, to begin with. What loving wife would go on such a long journey right after she married a man she loved? He had sacrificed years in longing for unrequited love. Something cleared in his heart when he realized that love also meant being able to let go and wishing the other the best. He would no longer chase after love, the ghost of a happy future. He had found peace with himself and let go of his grudge. At that moment, the mark on his chest also cleared. The great skald Reiki returned home, with a clear heart and a clear mind. While there were no new stories of love, the wise that had once set off from their village, Reiki made sure that she was remembered as a hero of their people in his songs and stories. In the peaceful years after his return, the skald never took a wife, but he raised many disciples like a family. But his peaceful life found an end in tragedy when their village was razed to the ground by a calamity. Now a young man, the spitting image of Reiki, tread through the ruins of this village once again. After seeing his disciple, his family, and his people die, the Hydra Slayer had returned. The old familiar roads and buildings had crumbled to dust. The whole region was dead, covered in a curse of decay. Nobody had settled here or rebuilt his hometown. It was impossible for people to survive in such a place. The land was cursed and the power of death filled the air. The Faer did not fear the curse of decay. The flesh may sicken and rot, but the Ithildan within was not bothered by it. Reiki had been given a chance by a mystic blacksmith and regained a body and was even given a choice. The old skald decided to serve the man, after a visit to his old home. Walking through the cursed streets, he couldn't help but wonder how the demon had recovered his soul from such a place. In the eerie silence, he could quietly hear a woeful whining in the distance. In the place, he had once built a house and waited for his wife. In the place he had spent most of his life alone, he found a dark figure weeping. She was covered in shadows, looking like a woman wearing a black mourning dress with lots of lace. Hearing the steps on the crumbling earth, she suddenly looked up. A pale face like porcelain, with black tears running down her cheeks. A familiar face. Familiar eyes. Are Reiki? Buletin, but you are dead, you died because of me, everyone. Another burst of tears and sobbing shook her frail body. The tears that fell dissolved the ground below like acid. Reiki stared at her in shock, unsure what to do. Love had returned and he was unsure whether he was happy, sad, or angry about it. She had been the calamity, but it was obvious that she had never wished for this to happen. He stepped closer to her. She panicked but didn't move. The skald knelt beside her and lifted his hand to her cheek. The Faer wiped away her tears with his thumb, which immediately started corroding and regenerating. Just what happened to the wise woman I fell in love with so long ago? Reiki, she cried out and embraced him tightly like someone drowning and looking for a hold. His clothes blackened and her tears burned into his flesh, but he didn't mind. This time he had a body that could withstand her embrace. Chapter 642 White Hilt. The enchantment created with the help of Finn's luck was called the White Hilt enchantment. Seth had no idea what this was supposed to mean, but the system often chose names that were hard to comprehend. With Finn watching from the back, the blacksmith began engraving the complicated enchantment onto the whole sword. Unlike before, he was able to recognize some familiar strokes among the complicated lines. He found traces to the fire circuits in several places along the blade and hilt. Seth couldn't quite tell why, but this kind of expansive enchantment really sapped his energy quicker than the normal ones and he soon started sweating profusely. He suddenly heard Finn's voice behind him, breaking his focus. He looked up to see the stone floor around him glowing red-hot with the air around him shimmering. Finn was sitting on the ground some distance away, drenched in sweat and close to losing consciousness. Finn! Are you okay? What had even happened? I am fine, but I think I need to take a break from watching, she answered, forgetting to talk cutely. Are you sure? He asked worried. Yes, just get back to your work, I will be okay, she said with an embarrassed smile. That won't do. Let's go look for Link and get some ice to cool you down. A heat stroke is nothing to joke about. But I said I heard you. Ignoring her protests, he picked her up and brought her to the kitchen, where he found Link busy with cooking, as always. Seth could help but wonder about the man's passion for food, watching the dozens of pots and pans simmering. He was running back and forth between preparing ingredients, instructing helpers, and managing the stoves, like a conductor leading an orchestra. Sometimes Seth wondered, why Link didn't just change his class to a chef completely. But he also understood the world they lived in. Who would give up their ability to protect themselves and grow stronger when the world could come crumbling down at any moment? Link, could we have some ice for Finn? Seth asked after waiting for the right timing, when the chef seemed like he had a moment to spare. You came at just the right time. I have developed some new ice cream using the milk of a mudilk, a kind of mutated monster cow. Here, try these. Link spoke quickly, as if without much thinking. With what almost looked like a sleight of hand, 2 tubs of ice cream appeared on the counter before them. Before the blacksmith could speak up, the gourmet hunter had already rushed back to his pots, pans, and ovens. He still looked at the man's back when he felt his hand lighten. The fairy had taken the chance and dove into the creamy cold sea of her ice cream tub. Steam was coming off her, as she sang into the creamy goodness. You seriously have to stop bathing in your food. Seth commented, picking the other tub and a spoon to taste it. You are just jealous because you are too big to bathe in your favorite food. Finn scolded, slurping the treat with glee. The ice cream tasted good, a little like vanilla with a tinge of honey and cinnamon. It felt refreshing and Seth noticed that his mana and stamina were regenerating more quickly. He smiled wryly, even a simple ice cream now had effects similar to a potion. Link's skills had really grown. It was when Seth decided that even when Link couldn't choose to become a chef by class, he would support his dreams in the kitchen even further. Once the fairy had eaten or rather absorbed the ice cream, she seemed to do a lot better and stickier. Seth also finished his tub and returned to the workshop, while Finn was banished to the bathroom. She really needed to wash up. By the time he returned, the workshop had already cooled down to the normal levels of heat. It had been the first time something like this had happened, so he really had no expected it. But it was also his first time that he had messed with the enchantment of a god. He was just glad he had not tried to make an ice sword. If working on the enchantment had frozen him solid, he would have had no resistance to it at all. Looking at the silver blade covered in complex and beautiful engravings, its orange sheen had something endearing. He put the blade back onto the enchantment table and continued his work. It was not much more to go, to finish it. Fortunately, he had not messed anything up, when his concentration broke. By the time he did the last stroke and the enchantment glowed up as a sign of success, the floor around him was once again close to liquefying. He was just glad that his crafting stations were unharmed by the heat. With the sword's body finished, he began working on its soul. Edward had been unlucky with ego souls, Tanomole had no shortage of other souls. Since Seth had given up on making a sword focused on fire at that point, his attention went somewhere else. Looking at the souls with the skills of knights, he found something nostalgic. The soul he held in his hands was that of a Dullahan, but it had a rare trait, loyalty. Although he was surprised at first to see such a trait in an undead, the goat made him quickly realize that it wasn't unusual. Dullahans were often great heroes or soldiers that had lost their lives. It was no wonder that they would often feature a trait like loyalty. The trait was different from the loyal soul that was currently powering his golden fleece, as it had specific effects within the system instead of being a descriptor of the soul itself. While it was a knightly soul, the divine enchantment he chose for it was fiery in nature. Ixion's punishment seemed like a rather clear one, compared to the others. Ixion was a man who had thrown his father-in-law into a fire pit when he was his guest and later insulted the gods by abusing their hospitality. His punishment in Tartarus was to be strapped to a burning wheel for eternity. Its sigil showed a simplified human bound to a wheel. It seemed like quite the horrible punishment, though Seth wouldn't know. He had lost all fear of fire. The sword soul was covered in patterns of flames and thorny chains when he finished the sigil. Ding! You have finished a legendary item. +1 to all attributes. Ding! A synergy between powers has changed your item. The moment Seth pulled the sword out of the bubble of sticks, it flared up with a blazing white flame. The heat in the workshop rose sharply, making the blacksmith frown. Before he could check the options, he had to be able to see the item at all. Sword ego. He tried to contact the automaton ego. Name has been registered as White Hilt, of Restraint. Awaiting orders. Can you turn off the flaming blade? Affirmative. Immediately the blinding white flames receded and allowed him to inspect the blade. The legendary Olympian silver was glowing cherry red from the heat, with the engravings glowing in bright contrast to the darker rest of the blade. Seth found that the circumstances during the enchanting were not the only drawback of the White Hilt enchantment. There would be no problems to use it on Olympian silver because it was refined using pure fire energy, but if used on a weapon of another material, it was an almost guaranteed self-destruction. White Hilt of Restraint. Legendary, Ego. Physical. Damage, 2650. Fire damage, 1500. Durability, 9000. 1 Blessing of Wind. 2 plus 200% power on skills and spells. 3 Nurgle's Burning Heat. 4 Flaming Sword. 5 Loyalty. 6 Ixion's Bind. 7 Passive Skill, Nurgle's Swordsmanship. 8 Active Skill, Burning Strike. 9 Active Skill, Ember Rain. The resurfacing of a forgotten legend. Created by the collaboration of craftsman Smith and Master Smith, the first master enchanter of Earth. A mixture of skills and a daring interference with divine knowledge have led to an unexpected result. Requirements, Maker's approval. Chapter 643 Knife. Ignoring the enchantment's drawbacks, Seth almost laughed out loud when he read the weapon's effects and how they played together. This sword was just unfair, especially in his hands. On the other hand, it was completely useless against him and people similar to him. The most special effect was probably Ixion's Bind, the main effect of the Olympian enchantment. It was quite literally the effect to restrict the movement of those who were affected by the burning status ailment after an attack with the sword. They would be bound for the whole duration they were on fire. It was useless against someone like Seth who was immune to fire damage. He could get the status ailment, but to anyone else, this could turn into a nightmare. Being forced to endure being burned alive without being able to do something against it actively. Especially when many of the other effects played into elongating the duration of burning and strengthening the damage of fire. Nurgle's Burning Heat, for example, added the cursed effect of increasing the duration of burning effects while the fire could not be extinguished by simple water. The Flaming Sword was responsible for adding not just a basic fire damage to every attack when activate, it also improved the chance to set a target on fire by 75%. While Edward had no fire skills, the sword came with 2 fire skills, that also profited from the effect of Olympian Silver that strengthened skills. Burning Strike was a directed attack that shot a wave of fire straight forward with a swing of the sword. It was most likely the result of a synergy between Nurgle's swordsmanship, which gave a basic buff to attacks with a sword, and the White Hilt enchantment. The second active skill, Ember Rain, on the other hand, seemed to be the result of the Dullahan's soul and the demon's power. Ember Rain burned the wielder's mana to shoot flames straight into the air. They would rain down in a circle around the caster. The area at roughly a radius of 10 m with the wielder in the center. Both skills had a fixed 50% chance to set enemies on fire. Lastly, Loyalty was one of the most simple effects, as it improved attack and defense when protecting or fighting for the target of the wielder's loyalty. A useful effect for any good knight. Testing the sword, Seth could feel the connection to the flames on the blade. If someone like Seth, with the trait Kin of Fire, were to wield in, it was just unfair, since all the fire effects would be strengthened to the max. Although the binding effect only counted for burning caused by the sword, using pyrokinesis the blacksmith was sure he could do some shenanigans. However, just like with Yatagan Mim, hoarding all the good stuff was not the solution. It would do well in Edward's hands. Especially since the Faer had a tremendous amount of mana because of his strengthened soul. He would have to caution him though, since using up all his mana would sharply weaken a Faer, since regeneration and movement enchantments would stop working, resulting in slower movement. It was already late, but there was one more thing he wanted to make. It was a spontaneous idea. Originally Seth had planned to make a weapon, or an armor for Link, but seeing him in the kitchen today changed his mind. A single bar of Olympian silver was now heating up in the furnace. Although leveling was important, it was obvious where the man's passions truly lay. The initial idea of making legendary items for everyone was to help them stand out while many gods were still looking for champions so they could gain their protection. The bard of metal was glowing brightly when Seth pulled it from the fire and started forging it with Karen's obol. A dark hum filled the smithy as dark runes flowed into the bright silver, giving it a dark purple sheen. Were Seth to make a weapon or armor for the gourmet hunter that was optimized for battle, Link was more likely to receive the attention of a god of hunt, or archery. However, this wasn't in his best interest. With Link's passion, he was more fit for something else. The ballad that Seth was chanting in dark voices was categorized as a lesser ballad of gluttony. Obviously, one of the first things he had done when he became an infernal skald was to look for demonic ballads of the 7 sins. It seemed clear to him that those would be the strongest. Despite looking for a long time, he didn't find any that would have made his heart flutter. There was no ballad of lust that could make charm any target, nor was there a ballad of gluttony that could just infinitely and unfairly grow by devouring enemies. The only ballads he had found at the time were some that were categorized by the 7 sins, but they would always be lesser or inferior this and that. Just like there were many gods with similar domains, there were also many demons who shared the domains of the 7 sins. Under the influence of the demonic tunes, the piece of metal in his hand slowly turned into a long chef knife. This ballad he was currently using was dedicated to Apeti, one of the demons of gluttony. He was also known as Gourmet Demon and was known to give blessings that made food more delicious, increase damage against ingredients or increase their quality. Absolutely useless for a weapon, but a godly advantage for a kitchen knife. The price for the gluttony demon's power was that the knife would absorb a small percentage of the ingredients it was used on, or the chef could also sacrifice a finished meal for the item instead. Once the overall shape was forged, Seth stepped back to the grinding wheel. A kitchen knife had a different edge geometry than a dagger or a sword. He arbitrarily left a pattern of hammer marks along the spine of the blade for aesthetics. For the other enchantment, he used ones he had learned a long time ago, but never used, since he prioritized other enchantments. One of them was the simple circuits that allowed the knife to become self-cleaning, also corrosion resistance, and the complex circuit of purification. The latter being able to detoxify water and ingredients. They were standard enchantments for high-grade cooking utensils, which was another explanation for why Seth seldom used them on weapons. Since this was a spontaneous product, the soul he had previously prepared was not fitting. Looking through the souls he had in his inventory, his eyes fell on the 2 souls of the cultivators that had attacked him a while ago. They were only big and rare rated, but they both had something called innate blade talent. He didn't quite know what effect it would have, but it seemed to be in tune with wielding knives. As for the enchantment on the soul knife, there were no deities among the enchantment that had anything to do with cooking. Maybe Tantalus, who killed and cooked his own son to feed him to the gods. However, his punishment was the exact opposite of eating or cooking. Instead, his attention went to the enchantments he unlocked when he reached the master tier in enchantment. Olympian sharpness or Olympian durability was the most likely candidate and he chose the former. Sharpness seemed more appropriate for a chef knife. It wasn't like Link was going to fight and block with the knife, also legendary Olympian silver was already extremely durable. There was nothing to worry about even if Link got into a fight. The only problem was that Seth was already quite tired from the white hilt enchantment and the Olympian sharpness was not any less complicated. The blacksmith seriously deliberated about finishing the knife at another time. Looking at the knife and soul armament in front of him, the decision was not as hard as he thought. Taking a deep breath and loosening his limbs, he began engraving the circuit on the soul knife. Although he was tired, thanks to absolute focus and craftsman's precision was able to successfully engrave the Olympian enchantment into the soul and finally fuse the soul and vessel together. Ding! You have finished a legendary item. +1 to all attributes. Ding! A synergy between powers has given birth to an ego. The blacksmith was about to cry tears of blood. He had been convinced he would be able to level up to master with the knife, but the proficiency bar had stopped less than a hair's width away from filling up. It would have been really poetic if the item that made him a master was not even a weapon made for fighting. But it shouldn't be, he could only shrug and check the knife. Gourmet knife. Legendary, ego. Physical damage, 2300. Durability, 9000. 1 blessing of wind. 2 plus 200% power on skills and spells. 3 appetite demon leave 1. 4 item is immune to weak and medium corrosion effects. 5 self-cleaning. 6 purification. 7 Olympian sharpness. 8 passive skill, innate blade talent. A terrifying kitchen utensil from the smithy of craftsman Smith in collaboration with the first master enchanter of Earth, Master Smith. Divine sharpness coupled with a demonic blessing can make even the most mediocre chef shine like a diamond. Chapter 644 Appetite Demon. An ego? Where did the ego come from? Was the notification this time a little different? He could vaguely remember it saying something about an ego, but he was too preoccupied with not leveling up to the master tier. Checking the options, he found what was the cause for the change. Instead of gaining the blessing of Apeti as planned, the power of the demon and the soul armament had given birth to an ego called the Appetite Demon, which seemed like a weaker clone of Apeti, the Gourmet Demon. The functions of improving damage to ingredients and improving their quality had not changed, but was an option with a level attached to it, which meant it could grow. Seth tried to communicate with the chef knife, but there was no answer to his telepathic questions. Maybe it was a dormant ego? Or maybe its level was still too low to do anything but grant the basic effects. Seth had not planned for this, but he found it quite fitting, that the gourmet hunter would now have an appetite demon to grow. The other options were as expected. Purification would be able to get rid of weak and medium toxins in the material it cut, and self-cleaning made sure it was always sterile. The passive skill innate blade talent improved the power and proficiency gain for skills that had the wielding of a knife or dagger at their core. Seth was not 100% sure, but he was of the opinion that Link did have the dagger mastery skill. Whether this passive also counted for anything cooking related, he had no idea. The description of Olympian sharpness was quite simple. When supplied with mana, it would create a mana edge that could exponentially increase the cutting power of the knife, to the point of cutting any material, lesser than the material of the knife, like butter. Testing the mana edge a little made him aware of a big problem. He had just tested a little and cut a use gash in one of his workbenches. With this kind of power, Link would split his kitchen counter like a woodcutter firewood. He would need to make a fitting cutting board if the gourmet hunter was supposed to use it in the kitchen. But that would have to wait for tomorrow. It was close to midnight now, and Seth was way too tired to still make something like a cutting board now. Putting the knife away in his inventory, he cleaned up his tools and returned to his quarters, where he found the already sleeping Mina on the couch. He turned off the TV and carried her to bed, before washing up and joining her for the night. "I tried waiting for you," Mina mumbled drowsily when he returned. "I'm here now." Ding. Skill, Blacksmith, Craftsman, Leave 9 has become Blacksmith, Master, Leave 1. Ding. Title, Master Blacksmith gained. You have reached the Master tier in Blacksmith, plus 10 Strength, unlocked function, Blacksmith Mark. Ding. Title, the first 3 gained. You are the first player to become a Master Blacksmith on this server. Every item description of every item you made so far will be retroactively edited to include this title and your achievement. The blacksmith held his final work as a craftsman in his hand and raised it to the heavens to appraise the result of his work. With the size of 1/2 of an arm's length and mystic engravings, it was a great silver tablet, no, a legendary cutting board. Durable cutting board. Legendary. Physical def, 3000. Durability, 15,000. 1 Olympian durability. 2 self-repair. A cutting board with little going for it, but its high durability. It is surprising that this stems from the hands of Master Smith, the first Master Blacksmith and Master Enchanter of Earth. He had surrendered to his destiny and used the cutting board for his final jump to the Master tier. It was a thin, even sheet of legendary Olympian silver, embedded into a block of artificial adamantium to bulk it up a little. The blacksmith had not given it a soul, the only effects were the enchantment of Olympian durability, which almost doubled the basic durability, and self-repair, which was the result of the Blood Drinker ballad, without any additional enchantment. The cutting board could absorb blood and repair itself. As a legendary material, there was little some blood could do to strengthen the material, which was the most likely reason it had no self-strengthening option. The main purpose of the board was to act as a pair with the gourmet knife. Aside from use in the kitchen, it was relatively useless. Well, maybe Link could block an attack with it, if he was really desperate. Seth sighed and unceremoniously threw it in his inventory when a sudden light emanated from his chest. The spot was hot and there was the familiar feeling of sucking energy from his body. Just like the first time, it felt good and came with a sense of euphoria. This was the formation of his blacksmith's mark. Just like during the formation of the punch, a black, not golden, stamp slowly emerged from his chest. Unlike the punch, it was a rectangular, roughly 30 centimeters long metal bar with similarities to a chisel, with a small negative of the mark at the tip. His personal mark. Using this stamp created by the system, he could mark would have the same effects as the punch, making it recognizable for anyone with eyes, and imbuing older items with the passive buffs they would have gotten if he had been a master at the time of their creation. Testing his new stamp, he found that it was similar to the goldsmith's punch. Where the punch showed a hammer in a halo of flames, the mark showed an anvil in a halo of flames. Again, the design choice seemed very simple, but he came to like it more than expected. At a loss, Seth stared at the 3 skills that now had reached the master tier, and at the other skills that had now the master tag behind them, like soul forging and blueprints. It had been a short-term goal for him to strive for, but now that he reached it he realized, nothing had really changed. He expected something big to happen, but there wasn't really anything. He still had things to make and his everyday life wasn't going to change because of this. This wasn't to say that there were no gains at all. The blacksmith's mark had formed in a similar way as the goldsmith's punch. He could use it to copyright all his works and even improve older ones. There were also more blueprints that had been unlocked. Just like when he reached the master tier in enchantment, his blueprints now also showed some more Olympian blueprints, all dubbed basic Olympian this and that. In general, blueprints now showed more advanced schematics that involved his rank in all three, Blacksmith, Goldsmith, and Enchantment. The most prominent of those were magic armor sets, among which was also one for basic Olympian armor. In general, there were 3 ways for a blacksmith to create set items. The most important was that all pieces needed some sort of connection that led to an overall improvement or a special effect. One such way was cohesion of design, where the design itself led to an improvement of effects if worn together. The Dark Knight armor the dwarf master Tord had once gifted Seth was a good example. It had an intimidation effect against others if all parts were worn together. The second was a cohesion of materials, especially when a blacksmith used a lot of special monster parts. Monster materials often had specific traits they retained even after. The better the quality and the more of the material of the same monster, or type of monster was used, the bigger was the chance for a set effect. Seth's scorpion armor was a prime example of this. He had used the whole carapace that was tinged by demonic and divine powers in a compound with dragon scales for his armor, leading to an overwhelming set effect. Of course, the cohesion of design also played into that a little. The third and hardest way a blacksmith could achieve a set effect was cohesion by enchantment. In this case, the blacksmith also needed to have a good understanding of enchantments. The circuits of every single part would be planned out in a way that they would connect and strengthen if pieces of the set were worn together. Seth also had a fourth way, which was cohesion by soul. However, this depended heavily on the soul used and had little to do with the blacksmith's craftsmanship. Cohesion by enchantment was the strongest kind of armor when it came to set effects not dependent on materials, but also the hardest to develop and produce. A lot could go wrong when messing around with enchantment circuits, which was why the development took ages. In addition, it needed high skill in both disciplines to produce such armor sets without a mistake. Minas Mar's Oath armor, which Seth had developed with a lot of help from Alzalsar, was one such armor. It was the only one Seth had ever made himself, and the only one that had been part of his blueprints up to now. Chapter 645 Celebration. By reaching the master tier in all 3 of his crafting skills, there were a few new blueprints for magic armor sets and jewelry, all with the corresponding enchantments. The moment he saw them in his blueprint overlay, he realized where they came from. After seeing examples of Forgebrand's works in the treasury of the imperial family of Krona, he could judge that these were designs left by his predecessor. They were designed to be worn by melee fighters and had each their own specialization. Aside from basic augmentations to physical attributes and attack power, they were specialized in granting resistances and improvements to specific elements. Remembering what the egos of the items told him, Seth was quite clear that the dwarf had not made these for others, but to adapt to opponents of different elements when he hunted for souls. As intelligent as that may seem, Seth could only guess that Forgebrand made these at the start of his adventure. With the kind of options soul infusion and soul forging could give, he doubted the dwarf didn't come to the same conclusion as himself, which was to make one ultimate set of armor. On the other hand, Forgebrand had a completely different set of skills, most likely much more terrifying than Seth's. The blacksmith had no idea how exactly the dwarf had made the golem forge, just to give an example. Even a golem like Cerberus was still beyond Seth's capabilities. When it came to Cerberus, even Alzalsar was unsure whether she could beat the golem in a fight. The only drawback was that he was bound to the smithy, which severely restricted his movement radius. All that aside, he now had the blueprint to turn the Lord of Minas Mar into Mystic Rangers, like in the old TV show he used to watch as a kid. The armor sets gave really good improvements aside from their specific elemental option. The best part was that these effects were independent of the materials and souls used, which meant he had more than enough options to further customize these armor sets to the specific wearer. The only one who wouldn't need it was probably Tekker. The ape armor still held up, even in comparison to these blueprints. After checking the changes, Seth closed the system windows. Armor sets were something for the future, he currently had other stuff to finish in preparation for their excursion. Now that he was a master in everything, he could finish the rest of the items without worry. Even though, he didn't feel like continuing for the day. He had finally reached the master tier. Today he would celebrate. Tower, make a tower-wide announcement, that we celebrate today since I reached the master tier. So the system wasn't going to give him anything special or meaningful as a prize to master all 3 basic crafting skills. Then he would have to do it himself. It had been too long since everyone simply took a break for a day. The sphere in his pocket started vibrating as several people called him as reaction to the sudden announcement. He simply opened them in a group call. What he was going to say was meant for everyone. Seth, it's great you reached Master Tier, but what are you doing? We have several dungeons scheduled for today. Mary's voice was the first that complained, exasperated. Dungeons, smungeons. Today I shall abuse my power as Tower Master and make everyone take a break. You too, Mary. Minasmar will close up for today and we will plunder Link's reserves. My reserves? A voice asked, faltering, but was overshadowed by others. What about our guard duty? Monique asked weakly. I will send the Golem Knights instead. What about the shops? We can't just. They will also close for today. I want all the members currently staying in Delta to come to Minasmar and celebrate. I'm opening the banquet hall for today. At the mention of the banquet hall, all voices in the group call fell silent. All right. I'm finishing up here and come down. Just let me assemble the clerks and we will be there in a jiffy. The dissenting voices immediately agreed to come. Most of the other just called to congratulate him and were now cheering that they would be there in a moment. The mentioning of the banquet hall had everyone on their feet. To explain this, one had to look back at the time when they were still new to Minasmar, this subterranean magic tower, or rather a magician's palace. Aside from the facilities and accommodations, a lot of parts were sealed off, because they took a lot of energy to run. The reason Minasmar had excess energy to sell, was precisely because they were only running the essential parts of the palace. One of these switched-off parts was the Great Banquet Hall. With the full integration of Earth in the Pathworks, the monolevel on Earth had also sharply increased. This made the blacksmith less hesitant to put some of these places back into operation. In this case, the Great Banquet Hall. A magical place that could spawn any drink one wanted, from magic faucets, play individualized music, give light shows, and even offered an anti-gravity dance floor. These were just a few of the functions it was able to offer. Seth tidied up the workshop and left with light steps. Delta, Parliament offices. What do you mean? Minasmar pulled back their guards. Ichabod Longbottom, the temporary chancellor, exclaimed irately. Minasmar's tower master simply leaving during the announcement had not just hurt his ego, but also severely impeded the project itself. Many high-ranking people had left together with the tower master, and Longbottom had lost quite a lot of support afterward. As if them crashing the accessory market and angering the foreign merchants weren't bad enough. Not only that, his hands were completely bound when it came to Minasmar, as more than half the parliament supported them. They have also cancelled all their dungeon for today. Their shops have also closed down for today. They even cancelled all the reservations for the third floor of the Turquoise Anvil. It seems like Minasmar has pulled their whole manpower out of Delta, sir. What was going on? How could they act so willfully? Was this a message for him? For Delta? Maybe they found out. No, there was no way that they found out about that matter. You said they pulled back all their people. Yes, sir. Why would he need to care about their intentions? This was a chance to gain back some faith in the church and the merchants. Send a message to the guild currently guarding the refugee district. They are to relocate and guard the city instead. After the recent event, we need a higher guard presence there. But sir, what about the refugees? What about them? There have been a lot fewer incidents recently. Relate the information to them that even Minasmar, the staunchest supporter, have pulled back their guards. It has to be safe now. Although the secretary wasn't fully convinced, there was nothing he could do but frown and follow the orders. Delta. Elder, the guards in Delta have been redistributed. Sitting cross-legged in the middle of an outlandish formation in the center of a dark hall, was a man draped in loose black robes. Half his body and face were covered in alien burns that refused to heal. It had been days since his fight with that terrifying witch. Even when he finally managed to slay the wench, the external elder regretted having acted in such a way before fully understanding the enemy's strength. The mystic magic that the priestess had used still threatened to take his life. Without the fleshly demon formation, he would not be able to withstand the burns for long. He wanted nothing more than to return and be treated by a heavenly doctor, especially since the natives had become less and less reliable. Those people that called themselves the Society, the elder never trusted them, but recently he was more and more convinced that they were scheming something behind their backs. Are you sure? Yes, our scouts reported that the guard in the refugee district has more than halved. It seemed like a great chance to cut their losses and make off with as much as they could grab. But the burned child had learned. He wouldn't take the bait that easily. This could also be a trap. Send more people to scout and report any changes. Yes, Elder. Chapter 646 Toughest Night. A peculiar dark knight stepped on the almost empty street. Half his armor was a deep black, the other half was a pallid grey. Wolfram was followed by the group of 30 golem knights of all sizes and inspected the state of the place. It had not gone unnoticed by the people of Sigma, that their protectors had diminished, prompting most of them to hide inside their allocated quarters. Curious eyes observed the knight, carrying a shield in one hand and a staff in the other, and the knight order behind him. The menacing knight lifted a small orb to his helmet. Master, something seems to be out of order. I register a lot fewer guards in the vicinity than the information stated, the cold, deep voice rang through the street. Wolfram had grown over the past weeks, while Seth was mostly busy making items. He had given the Angel Knight his trust and had him lead the Golem Knight. During their adventures in dungeons and explorations outside the district, the Golem's ego had grown quickly into a reliable subordinate. This was why Seth felt comfortable sending the Golem Knights as replacements for the Oath Guards. What do you mean? Seth's voice that came back had the voice of music and people in the background. As I said, the guards I can detect are less than half of what was supposed to be present. They are also not doing a very good job guarding, if I may add. With less than half the guard present, those present did their best not to stand out. Although the attacks had lessened, they were all people who treasured their life. Even if something happened, the chances they would jump out to help seemed low. A groan could be heard from the communication orb. Oh well, you should have enough manpower to make up for it, right? Try to find out what happened, but don't abandon your post. Stay until members of the Oath Guard arrive to take over. Although it was a pain in the behind, Seth didn't really worry. The golems had grown even stronger with Wolfram at their helm, and their leader alone could make up for the part of the missing guards. Yes, Master. Ending the call, the metal eyes wandered over the cityscape in front of him. There was really a lot to do. Elder, we lost contact with the scouts. The elder just nodded to show that he had taken notice. As expected, it was a trap. It was a shame to have lost their scouts, but it also showed the inability of the natives. There had been no news or warning from them. He really couldn't understand why the leader was insisting on working with them. Maybe this was the straw that would break the camel's back and the leader would finally take action. This world was stronger than they expected, as shown by their several setbacks. Their setbacks also showed that the natives were of less use than expected. Whether it was their strength, or their ability to gather information. He could use this chance to return to the sect and try to persuade the leader. With the number of outer disciples already in place, with a few more external elders and maybe some inner disciples, it wouldn't be a problem to replace their allies completely. They already had enough information to take foot in this place. If he did it right, maybe he could become a branch leader. With his talent, if he managed to monopolize the resources in this place, his chance to finally break through to Deo Severing. Kaie. A figure came flying in from the entrance, shot straight past him, and shattered into a rain of grey crystals on the wall behind him. In a heartbeat, his chi started rotating through the passages across his body and he madly absorbed the energy of the fleshly demon formation. It lost much of its efficacy because of this, but he had no time. It was a mere moment, but he had recognized the face of his messenger as he passed by his and was pulverized at the wall. The messengers were at the peak of golden core formation, whatever could finish him off like that, he needed all the strength he could gather to face it. The burns quickly receded from his body, leaving behind freshly healed skin. He spat out a mouthful of black rotten blood as he rose to his feet not a moment too late, to dodge a purple ray that moved in irregularly angled paths. His judgment was right, although he was only healed on the surface, had he tried to preserve her without exhausting the formation, the weird witchcraft may have hit him. With a wave of his hand, he closed the gates to the hall, to buy just a moment more. The only answer was the ear-shattering boom as something easily broke down the gates. In the ensuing dust cloud, he could finally see the silhouette of the attacker. It looked like a knight, one of the natives wearing these primitive kinds of armor. In one hand he held a shield, in the other he held a scepter with a purple glowing tip. You and your compatriots have been judged to pose a danger to public order. Please surrender peacefully or you will be subdued with force, a cold, deep voice rang through the hall. The elder didn't listen, he had already unsheathed his saber. His bright saber aura illuminated the room as he used the seventh demon blade dance in a surprise attack on the intruder. He turned into a bloody ray and instantly appeared behind the knight, ready to slash him in two, from the shoulder to the hip. Surprised, a heavy shock ran through his arm, as the saber art was inadvertently stopped by the shield of the knight, which had somehow reacted to his surprise attack. Criminal scum! Delta has no use for you and your kind. In a flash, the elder barely avoided the purple rays that suddenly flew from the tip of the scepter. Or so he thought. He felt a weird cold encroaching on his left arm. When he took the risk to look down, he found the fingers of his hand had already turned into a stiff grey metal, and the transformation slowly crept up his wrist. Furiously circulating his chi only slowed down the transformation. Decisively, his saber flashed and cut off his hand before turning back to the knight, who had just been standing there, watching him vigilantly. It's all over now, lawbreaker. Your spree is at an end. It's off to the lock-up now. As he spoke, another purple ray shot at the cultivator. You are underestimating me too much, pig. The elder easily dodged and charged at the knight. He was at the peak of the nascent soul stage, how could he be done in by some primitive? He stopped trying to contain his injuries and put his all into circulation, his 13 demon arts. The saber blade, now glowing in a bloody light, shot toward the knight, leaving a deep gash in the shield, that had appeared in its way. He did not let it break his moves, and got ready to chain his next strikes to shower the pig in a rain of saber light. Crimson lights flashing like a lightning storm filled the hall. Even other external elders had a problem breaking through his technique, once he started his flurry of blows. By the time his move came to an end, he was breathing heavily. He should have been satisfied, but his face was gaunt, stricken by horror. None of his moves had done any damage. Some were blocked by the shield, some by the scepter, and others left deep gashes in the armor, but he never felt the cutting of flesh. His opponent, covered in gashes, had not lost even a drop of blood. Just standing there and defending, eating up everything he threw at him. The purple glow of eyes behind the helmet, never losing trace of him, as if watching a child acting up, staring deep into his soul. Shit, he cursed. A hand was lost and his injury from his fight with the witch was flaring up again, his time was over. Even at his peak, he had not managed to leave a decisive blow. The elder came to the conclusion that he had to flee. The second he circulated his chi and used the blood ray escape art, the knight suddenly vanished. He had not seen him appear behind him, but he saw the purple staff suddenly smashing into his rib cage. Wasn't this his move? In shock, he realized that the knight had used the seventh demon blade dance, even more proficiently than himself. But it was just a fleeting thought, as the pain washed over him. A purple fire covered the tip, as it barreled through his body like a bulldozer. His strengthened bones could barely resist the force. As he felt them turn to powder, and the pain of his left lung being squashed, he also felt that terrifying energy invading his body. Was this how the messenger had died? His thoughts raced as time around him almost seemed to slow down. He had to get away, now. Before this witchcraft reached his dantian. Just you wait, this is not over. A huge explosion blew away the hall, as the elder detonated his chi and fled with his nascent soul. Chapter 647 Elaborate. Wolfram stood in the middle of a crater filled with rabble and debris. A purple shield surrounding him had prevented any harm. The many gashes on the armor slowly healed, as he was processing what just happened. He was learning. Other golems also worked their way out of the rabble all around him. They had come tumbling down together with the collapsing building that had stood above the hall. Looking up, Wolfram found that the explosion was so strong, that several of the subterranean levels of Delta had also collapsed. The cross-sections of halls and rooms could be seen along the edge of the crater, they were also filled with parts of the structures that had once stood on the surface above. Staring at the mayhem, Wolfram, who was about to report, slowly packed the orb away again. Report, the assailants have all been purged. There are no casualties on our side. There are no casualties among the civilians. However, we found large numbers of corpses in various states among the rubble, a knight approached and reported. He silently stared at the golem knight waiting for his orders. Wolfram's learning ego weighed all the possible options against each other before making a conscious decision. We will evacuate the civilians and relocate. Leave this to Delta's authorities. It was for the best if they didn't have anything to do with this and nobody connected them, or Minasmar with this. Sir. If you don't want to be scolded by Master, you better withhold any reports about our presence here. Relay this to the others. We have never been here. Warm and soft. Seth woke up with little to no recollection of the party. This was a prime indicator that it was a great party. The blacksmith felt great as he stretched and relaxed in the soft bed, with the sleeping Mina in his arms. "You awake?" she mumbled, feeling him stir. "Wanna continue what we started yesterday?" After spending the morning in bed with his girlfriend, the refreshed Seth went to the kitchen to get some breakfast, where he found a not-so-refreshed-looking Link. "Everything is gone." He wept in his empty kitchen. Seth could only look on with an awkward expression. Maybe a party with every one of Mina's mar had been too much on the reserves of the poor chef. "Link, I'm sorry. Don't you dare apologize. I'm just wallowing a little to make myself feel better. In the end, this was my fault," Link confessed. What are you talking about?" the blacksmith asked, more confused than before. "This was not about losing his reserves over the party. It is I, who could not hold back, once you gave me this divine knife. I gave in to my craving and could stop savoring the feeling of cutting ingredients with this. Oh, the memory. If only I could." Link was holding the knife like a lover, swinging it around dangerously at times. What had he done? Seth could only hope this was because he was still new to the knife, and not because it had some hidden curse that turned the wielder into a lunatic. But what if this was the true gourmet hunter? Had he awoken some underlying nature in the passionate chef? The bigger question was this a positive development, or should he find a reason to kick Link out of Mina's mar in the near future? It was a shame to let go of a great chef, but Link's current condition made Seth feel really uncomfortable by just being in the same room as the man with a manic attachment to a chef knife, and the knife. Especially the knife in the hand of the loony made him nervous. "So about the breakfast?" "I think I'm good." "Don't worry about it, Link." Seth made a strategic retreat and fled to his workshop. He still had some meals in his inventory, they would be enough. He could only hope the chef would come to his senses in the near future. Feeling refreshed after taking a break for a day and celebrating, the blacksmith felt fit to continue. With all his skills on the master tier, there was nothing to worry about anymore. The reason he had held back on making some of the items before he became a master blacksmith was because of soul forging. Although the skill to shape souls had its own levels, it scaled with his blacksmith skill. With it now on master, he would be able to make the items even more detailed, improving the overall performance of soul armament and infused soul armaments. The plan for today was to start on the items he was going to make from the special bones of Seth. With the characteristics of darkness, chaos, and destruction, the best recipient of items made from it were Mina, Lydia, and Evie, as mentioned before. Mina was very happy with her midnight set. Her weapons, the shard of biting ice and Asclepius needle, both being relics, were still good to go, too. What was left were her accessories. She wore the previous version of his mage accessory set and the ring of Gyges. When asked what she wanted to replace, the only thing that came to mind was an accessory. It was a similar story for Evie, the immortal witch really liked her undead armor and the gloves of the swarm. For now, she also would rather have an accessory for the expedition. With McCarthy now at their back and call, he also thought of getting more Necronite, so he could make her a fitting staff or wand in the future. This time, only Lydia wished for something other than an accessory, either a dagger or a pair of vambraces. Of course, this was before Seth had decided to hand her the angel dagger. However, nobody knew when the angel weapons would be acknowledged by the system, which was why he decided to do items for them, too, if time permits. When taking into account the amount of material and subtracting the material he needed for a ring for Mina and a pendant for Evie, he decided to make either a dagger or a pair of light vambraces for Lydia. He was about to get to work when his communication orb started vibrating. "Wolfram," he answered the call, puzzled. Seth barely remembered that there had been some problems with the number of guards. Had Wolfram found out what was going on? "You finally answered." "No, this is Lena." "Seth, what the?" She choked off the curse. "What is up with these golems? Where are the members of the Oath Guard? We had a celebration. I replaced them with the golems, so everyone could party. Why do you ask?" He could hear that she was upset, which made him come to the conclusion that something happened. This didn't mean he was going to acknowledge that he already knew that something happened. "Your golems detonated a whole building and we are standing on a mountain of corpses. And the golems won't cooperate. They say they would not stop patrolling until the next shift of Oath Guard came." "Wolfram, can you hear me?" "Yes, Master." "Wolfram, did you blow up a building?" "No, Master." "You heard him." "What about the corpses?" she threw in. "Wolfram, what about the corpses?" "Only partially." "Elaborate." "They were bad guys. See, He didn't do it. Leave my golems alone and let them do their job. Chapter 648 Commissioner Corden. The blacksmith had hoped that would solve the situation for now, but he was wrong. In the end, someone still had to personally go to Delta to assess the situation. As the only sober person with authority currently awake in Myanmar, this task, unfortunately, fell onto him. So instead of making items, he had to give a visit to Wolfram and Lena. On site he found a force consisting of people from Krina and Delta, with groups of 2 constantly following the Golem Knights on the patrol. Lena and another person stood beside Wolfram, who was stoically ignoring the 2 humans, giving him the stink eye. While the princess seemed to have calmed down, the guy seemed quite pissed. He seemed to be in his mid-40s with some graying stubble like he didn't shave in a while. He seemed a little unkempt in general with his hair in disarray and his wrinkled grey coat. What is going on here? Are you Seth Smith, the Tower Master of Myanmar? The man spat out his cigarette end and asked him politely. Who is asking that? Seth was in a good mood, so he decided to humor the man. Commissioner Corden, I'm in charge of the investigation pertaining to the divine strength drug. What happened that it involves you? Seth's confusion was only partially played. He even forgot the man's rudeness. The Tower Master knew about the true origin of the drug and its connection with the happening in the refugee district, but what had happened for the police to finally make this connection? What they? The answer to the question came when they wordlessly led him to the giant crater. The street on the side was filled with body bags. Teams of firemen and policemen were still occupied with removing rubble and retrieving corpses from the rubble below. What had Wolfram done while he wasn't looking? Yesterday around 8 p.m. there was a huge explosion that collapsed this building and 4 underground stories. We have been here all night, stabilizing the surrounding structures and searching the debris for survivors and corpses, he said with a slightly accusatory tone. Seth gave Wolfram a side glance. How terrible, but what does it have to do with Wolfram and the rest of my Golem Knights? According to the witness reports from the people of Sigma, your knights have been involved in several conflicts with invisible insurgents across the district, leaving their corpses in rooftops and alleys. The people they freed from the building stated that it was your golems that stormed the building, not long before the explosion. However, your Golem Knights have refused to comment and instead continued to repeat that they were on guard duty. It sounded bad the way the commissioner said it, however, Seth could filter out the important parts. Not only had the Golem Knights wiped out the invisible attackers they came across, they even saved people. Well done, Wolfram. So, why am I here? The commissioner was stumped for a moment. His left lower eyelid twitched slightly, before he grunted, and continued. Lena just silently listened. Was this her new hands-off approach? Many of the corpses retrieved from the rubble and the people saved from the building match the reports of missing people. Some of them were identified as bodies that had been stolen from hospitals and had a connection with the case of the divine strength drug. We hope to get a full report about what happened inside the building and how it came to the explosion, to continue our investigation into the drug business. Since your golems refused to cooperate, your presence became necessary. Corden's tone had become slightly more polite as they spoke. Having been here since the last evening, Seth could forgive his tone at the beginning. The blacksmith saw no reason not to cooperate. The commissioner seemed invested in the case. The Tower Master actually saw it as a chance to share his knowledge of the berserk pellet. Although he didn't really have any evidence, whether Corden would believe him was not his problem. On the other side, he was convinced that Wolfram had nothing to do with the explosion since he had no skills of that nature. Even if they tried to fine Myanmar for this, he was sure they could deny responsibility. Wolfram, tell me what happened since you reported to me yesterday. Yes, Master, the Golem said solemnly and reported what happened. Taking his guard duty very seriously, Wolfram had decided not to ignore the invisible presences that observed them from the shadows. How did you detect them? Corden threw in. The detection devices sold by Myanmar and the subsequent mediocre copies on the market only had a low detection range. It helped fight the attacker, but not finding the scouts and such that were hiding. Golems don't see the world like we do, at least not mine, Seth said without further explanation. The golems created with a soul could perceive the world in a similar way as the undead did. In the same way, the invisibility cloaks could not hide from the scent, heat cameras, or life detection, they also couldn't hide from the way his golems saw. Of course, Seth wasn't going to explain that he actually created golems with a soul, so he left it vague. After the short intermission, Wolfram continued, that they had followed one of these presences, that reported to another person, whom they followed to this place. They found many people held captive in terrible conditions. So while the rest of the night order freed the people held captive, Wolfram ended up facing off against their presumed leader, who finally self-destructed when he was cornered. "I'm sorry, Master. I did not expect the subject to self-destruct and cause this much damage." Wolfram apologized telepathically. "So instead of reporting it to me, you tried to deny all connection with the incident?" "Yes. Good reaction, well done. Next time, you have to swear in the people you save, too. This was your oversight. You should also always report to me, unless I am celebrating. In that case, just act the same way you did this time." Seth praised the golem. He had really gotten far in the past months. Although it was no good to have secrets from him, he liked that Wolfram had already learned the concept of denying responsibility. "Since you now heard Wolfram's story, I guess I also have some information that may help you. Though I have no evidence for any of it." Since he was the commissioner in charge of the investigation, Seth thought he was the best person to tell about the blood berserk pellet. Commissioner Corden seemed a little overwhelmed by the information and excused himself awkwardly. "If you knew all this, why didn't Minasmar publish this information sooner?" Lena asked, exasperated. "As I mentioned, this is just what you told us. Would it have made a difference without evidence? Now there is at least some evidence, so I told you," Seth said in a nice way that it wasn't his job. "I wasn't talking about this. Knowing that Earth is connected to another world not part of the Pathworks is important information for us," the princess complained. "Oh, us being Krana? To be honest, I didn't think of it," the blacksmith admitted. "I somehow assumed you already knew. It seemed like I had subconsciously overestimated Krana. It never came to him that they may not know about the invasion of another world." Retrospectively, Seth now understood why Krana didn't push stronger for the protection of the people of Sigma. They were trying to give Delta its independence. As a consequence, they obviously didn't get involved in something that seemed like a problem among the locals. Things were different if this involved an external power Delta wreaking havoc. "I'm sorry." He felt sorry for kind of avoiding Lena during the past weeks. It was nothing he had consciously thought about, but he now realized that he had. Maybe because of his dissatisfaction with her actions in Sigma, or the course Krana had taken with Delta. "You should be. But what exactly are you apologizing for?" "You don't have to know," he said with a teasing smile. He was too embarrassed to explain himself. She fixated on him for a moment, before letting go of the matter with a sigh. "On another note, what is up with these golems?" "What do you mean?" "You know Wolfram?" Lena had seen Wolfram and Ceres fight during their encounter with the 24th Ethnarch, so he didn't know what she was on about. "I mean the other ones. Since when did you have so many strong golems?" Seth looked down the street, at the golem knights. They had grown a little since Wolfram was leading them, but it wasn't like they had grown a lot. The lack of high-level beasts was the same problem for them, as for everyone else. The biggest change may have been, that they were finally developing egos and skills, which catapulted the strength up much quicker than raising levels. "What do you mean?" "They have been with me for a while. Since before the evaluation even." It was probably better when he didn't mention that there were a lot more golems and other beings he made going around Delta and Earth. Some of the Faer had even left Earth. Who knew what they were up to? They didn't talk for much longer, as Seth wanted to return to Mina's march. He had already lost enough time. Chapter 649 Sprite King's Pendant. After returning to Mina's Mar, he spent a while explaining what had happened to Mary and the other lords, who had finally woken and sobered up. The golems would still stay on patrol duty until the Oath Guard was back in shape. Once the important stuff was dealt with, the blacksmith returned to his kingdom. Reaching the master tier was only a milestone, there was still a lot to do to prepare for the guild's holy land. It was finally time to get serious with the bones of Seth. First up was a pendant for Evie. He had been looking forward to it, as he already had the perfect soul for it from the beginning. The malicious Sprite King's soul had the attributes of darkness and necromancy, fitting Evie's offensive capabilities perfectly. Darkness worked for a lot of her curses and witchcraft, while the immortal witch had also started learning necromancy lately. This way she didn't have to die first before she could make use of the items she already possessed. The blacksmith split off a small part of the special bones of Seth and brought it over to the jeweler's table. If there was one thing Seth lamented, then it was his lack of aesthetic sense. He had the skills to copy even the most intricate designs, but when left alone he would normally choose to make something minimalist. Instead of trying to come up with something impressive, Seth chose something personal. Once upon a time, the blacksmith had forged a pair of hands and forearm bones for Evie. Referring to this, he decided to make a distal phalanx or the bone of a fingertip as a pendant for her. It also fit with the overall theme of enchantments he planned on putting on it. First was the forging ballad he sang while shaping the finger bone. The song was dedicated to a demon called Murmur and praised the great battles he fought at the side of his undead armies. He was one of the demons known for their powerful skills in necromancy, able to resurrect the dead while binding their souls. His blessing could greatly increase a necromancer's power in dark magic such as curses. Seth spent a good amount of souls on this one since he didn't intend for another demonic enchantment on the pendant. He couldn't help but be tense up when he came close to finishing the finger bone. Even with all his preparations concerning his crafting luck, he could not help but fear the random effects bones of Seth, even when it seemed to be less drastic on the special rating. Since he had the intention to go step by step, to see how the chaotic factor would play into the items, he got the completion notification for a legendary item. Ding! You have finished a special item. Ding! A synergy of powers has changed your item. And the one for synergies changing his items. His heart still ached a little when he thought about not gaining any more attribute points from legendary items. Nervously he checked the current effects of the pendant. Fingerbone of Seth. Special. Durability, 5000. 1 dark magic is 150% more destructive. 280% cost reduction for dark spells and curses. 3 all undead under the wearer's command deal 50% more damage. 4 there is a small chance to create a special undead of random rank whenever an undead is created. 5 the costs of medium rank undead and above is lowered by 1 rank. 6 the Horde. A macabre pendant created by Master Smith, the first Master Enchanter and Master Goldsmith of Earth, using a divine material and demonic incantations to offer the wearer greater power of the dead. An item any necromancer would gladly sell their soul for. Seth gulped and he could feel his body relax. This was already really good. The blacksmith was no expert in the necromancer class, but judging by the descriptions of the effects, he could guess that this pendant could already enable a mediocre necromancer to build a powerful undead army. Summoning higher ranks at lower costs, improved power, special zombies, and then there was the effect the Horde. It lowered the cost of creating and improving the power of the undead, based on the number of already present undead. The bigger the Horde, the stronger it was and the easier it would become to grow. This sounded like an indispensable skill for a necromancer. Using a big magnifying glass, Seth engraved a complex triple formation for mana gathering onto the finger, to add the effect of improved mana regeneration. With that, the physical pendant was done. The next step was the soul armament. Looking at the massive, rare ego soul of the malicious Sprite King, it would have also been a great candidate for something like a necromancer golem, but he was too disgusted by the soul's original owner and ego. He rather used it to make an item. Getting rid of the soul's ego was definitely a necessary step in the crafting process. This time, unlike when working with the angel's soul, Seth had much more experience. It allowed him to be a lot more efficient when it came to wiping out the terrible personality of the person it once was. Ghostly cries echoed through the workshop, as Seth used the Wraithguard to hold down the soul. Unlike most souls, it was obvious that this man had spent a lot of time researching and experimenting with the afterlife. Where other souls would have a hard time just grasping what was going on, he was hard to deal with, even as just a soul. With the cacophonous screams as his background music, Seth did his best trying to identify and break the parts that constitute that man's personality without harming the knowledge he possessed. It was a hard process and not perfect by any means, but the sweating blacksmith felt quite confident that he had succeeded in wiping out the ego's personality. Even if it was necessary, Seth found that didn't feel good about it. Despite being convinced that this creature deserved it, there was something deeply unsettling in knowing that he had technically lobotomized a soul. He knew no better metaphor for the result he had achieved, than someone who had undergone a lobotomy. The soul was responsive and it had not lost any of its affinities, but it was unsettling conversing with it. The emotionless, mechanical answers. At least the soul still had a chance to grow into a better ego, once it became an item. That was his excuse to feel better about what he did. Afterward, he shaped the soul and got ready for the final step before finishing the pendant, the Olympian enchantment, the Blessing of Acheron. Seth's research found that Acheron, like Phlegethon, Cocytus, Styx, and Lethe, was a river in the underworld. It was namely the river of lost souls, that the dead had to cross to get into the underworld, by paying Charon his obol to ferry them over. Acheron, the river god, was also the god of the lake of pain in the underworld. As the first and biggest boundary to souls, Seth was relatively sure his blessing would have something to do with necromancy. The blacksmith would have chosen Hecate's blessing for Evie. The problem was that he had already used it and was not willing to sacrifice his cloak of Hecate. The next best enchantment for a necromancer he could find in the list was that of Acheron, as it had the highest chance to lend powers fit for necromancers. The presence that appeared, when he started to engrave the sigil of a simple spiral ending in a central circle, felt melancholic. Seth found it befitting of something called the River of Woe. Although it made him feel awkward, this may have been the least distracting blessing he experienced so far. When he finished the engraving on the soul, it was covered in a constantly changing wave patterns that sometimes looked like the faces of pained souls. Ding! You have modified a legendary item. Ding! A synergy between materials and enchantment has changed your item. Finger of Acheron. Legendary. Durability, 5000. 1 dark magic is 150% more destructive. 280% cost reduction for dark spells and curses. 3 all undead under the wearer's command deal 200% more damage. 4 there is a small chance to create a special undead of random rank whenever an undead is created. 5 the costs of medium rank undead and above is lowered by 1 rank. 6 the horde. 7 plus 90% darkness affinity. 8 plus 200% power to necromancy magic. 9 plus 150% power to curses and dark magic. 10 passive skill, Acheron's Dominion. 11 active skill, Acheron's Decree. 12 plus 95% mana regeneration. A macabre pendant created by Master Smith, the first master enchanter and master goldsmith of Earth, using a divine powers and demonic incantations to offer the wearer greater power over the dead and delve into the depths of dark magic. An item any necromancer or dark mage would gladly sell their soul for. It had worked. Looking at the additional effects and the 2 skills, it seemed that his guess had been right. The description of the 2 skills was not very long. Acheron's Dominion improved the control attribute. A unique attribute for necromancers that limited the amount and strength of the undead they could command. Acheron's Decree, no cost, 25 minutes cooldown. At Acheron's Decree, all hostile undead in the range of your call are forced to stay still and become defenseless for 30 seconds. Acheron's Decree was a crowd control skill exclusive for the undead. Useless unless one was fighting the undead, very effective when facing a huge army of undead with a megaphone or a similar skill to make one's call louder. In addition, there were more options that improved dark magic and curses. Seth was sure Evie would like it. Chapter 650 Couple of Darkness. Ding! You have finished a legendary item. Ding! A synergy between materials and enchantment has changed your item. Ding! You have finished a legendary item. Ding! A synergy between materials and enchantment has changed your item. Ding! A synergy between your trait Olympian myths and the divine enchantment has changed your items. The notifications rang out when he finished Mina's rings in the same manner as Evie's pendant. In his hand, Seth held 2 rings that resembled geometrically perfect circles of pure darkness, emanating a mysterious allure. They were simple rings that bore no gem, but each had a row of fine lines that formed a script of demonic runes. They glowed dimly on the black rings when the 2 were close to each other. Originally, Seth only wanted to make 1 for Mina, but he couldn't help making 2 when he got a new idea while pondering over the Olympian enchantments fitting her class. It started with researching Nyx and Erebus, the personified night and darkness. He had been thinking between the 2 of them when he found that they were actually a couple. Knowing this, gave Seth the idea to try and make 2 rings as a set, instead of deciding on one of them. This also necessitated that he found 2 fitting souls, which was a bit harder to accomplish. Even Tunomol didn't have a huge assortment of massive souls, much less ones of every element. When it came to souls, Seth had to make do with what he had. Using the lover's soul and fragments of the Ethnarch's soul, he fused them into massive souls. They had more or less the right attributes and Seth could imagine Mina being able to make good use of telekinesis. As for the demonic enchantments, the 2 Olympian enchantments would be a massive support to Mina's ability in surprise attacks and shadow magic. However, except for Mina's weapons, there were little enchantments that directly improved her damage, as most effects of her armor improved her skills and attributes. Since the Olympian enchantments boosted her abilities to hide, Seth chose demonic enchantment to improve her ability to deal damage. He chose the demons with them being a set in mind. 1 demon per ring, with a fitting forging ballad and an inscription. The first pieces he chose were dedicated to Andras, a very powerful and ancient demon known for his brutality and primal rage during combat, but also a manipulator of animosity and aggression, his own and those of others. The ballad and inscription he chose brought out both of these aspects. A ballad with a brutal rhythm, that supposedly gave the wielder the ability to immerse themselves in their rage to gain greater strength. The catch of this enchantment was, that there was a high possibility to lose oneself in the slaughter. Similarly, the inscription gave one the ability to induce this kind of rage in others, sowing discord among a group and having a target go berserk for a limited time. Of course, this berserk state also had a chance to strengthen the target. With this in mind, the bard chose the second demon quite carefully. The pieces he decided on were dedicated to Eligos. He was also an ancient demon and adept combatant. However, Eligos specialized in strategy and foreseeing the opponent's moves. One demon brought the primal rage, the other a clear and calculating mind in combat. The ballad of Eligos he chose would help to keep a clear mind in battle and predict the enemy's actions. The inscription was said to be able to protect the wearer against dark influences. With this, he hoped that the two enchantments would have a restraining and empowering effect on each other if both rings were worn. He had already patted his shoulder for coming up with such an ingenious method, but his jaw dropped, when he found that the changes were much grander than he thought, and not because he did something impressive. Ring of Nyx. Legendary. Couple of Darkness set 1/2. Durability, 5000. 1 dark magic is 200% more destructive. 280% cost reduction for dark spells. 3 grants the trait, Nightwalker. 4 plus 100% damage in darkness. 5 active skill, Primal Rage. 6 active skill, Blessing of Andras. 7 active skill, Telekinesis. 8 passive skill, Curse of the Lover. Set effect. Passive skill, Offspring of Darkness. Active skill, Nyx. Active skill, Erebus. Cursed one of a pair of rings created by Master Smith, the first Master Enchanter and Master Goldsmith of Earth, with the help of sinister deities and ferocious demons using mysterious means. Should never be worn without the counterpart. Ring of Erebus. Legendary. Couple of Darkness set 1/2. Durability, 5000. 1 dark magic is 200% more destructive. 280% cost reduction for dark spells. 3 grants the trait, Associate of Darkness. 4 plus 100% damage in darkness. 5 plus 150% power to curses. 6 active skill, Shadow Haze. 7 passive skill, Strategist's Mentality. 8 passive skill, Blessing of Eligos. Set effect. Passive skill, Offspring of Darkness. Active skill, Nyx. Active skill, Erebus. One of a pair of rings created by Master Smith, the first Master Enchanter and Master Goldsmith of Earth, with the help of sinister deities and ferocious demons using mysterious means. The combination Seth had been so proud of, had fortunately worked out as intended. Primal Rage was the power of Andras. The wearer of the rings would constantly build up rage over the course of a battle. It would greatly enhance the physical damage in battle, but also slowly overtake the wearer's mind. A user without the necessary care could end up trapped in this circle of rage, unable to discern friends from foes and attacking anything in sight. On the other hand, literally, were the Blessing of Eligos and the Strategist's Mentality. The first improved resistance to crowd control, curses, and mental attacks during battle. The latter was not unlike the 3D maneuver assistance. The skill created an overlay that helped with predicting the movements of enemies and inhibited any mental effects from affecting the wearer's mind during battle. These two passive skills had a restraining effect, virtually cancelling out the negative effect of Primal Rage, as all of them were confined to combat. By keeping a clear mind, the wearer would be able to exit combat at any time, not having to fear the continuous effect of rage. And then there was the Blessing of Andras, which was a magic, not unlike a curse, one could cast on others. It had the ability to sow discord and incite rage. Those affected had less growth in strength and a greater likelihood to enter a berserk state. These effects seemed already very powerful, however, these paled when compared to the effects the divine enchantments offered. Most prominently the set effects. Nyx and Erebus were intriguing because their skill description seemed to make them out to be the same skill. They would summon a domain of darkness with a radius depending on the user's affinity with the darkness element. When Seth tried Nyx, it enveloped his whole workshop in twilight. When he looked out at the hallways he found it also in darkness, as were the other workshops close by. Whedon, Hone, and the others had stuck their heads out in the hallway, wondering what was going on. It took a full 30 minutes for light to return to the world. Next, he tested Erebus and the difference became clear immediately. Where the first was the cool twilight of a clear night, this one was absolute, overbearing darkness like one would experience in a cave deep down in the belly of the earth. Seth as the current wearer was not affected, but he could still feel that this was a darkness that would weigh heavily on another's mind, making them nervous, paranoid, and fearful. The blacksmith could only think that the skills lived up to their name. Still, he found Offspring of Darkness even more impressive. It was not one skill, but a collection of effects that could randomly be added to the wearer's attacks. They were all based on the children of Nyx and Erebus, some of which Seth had individual enchantments for. The skill description named Hypnos, Thanatos, and Garaz among others. Their effects were sleep, instant death, and old age. Although the chances of triggering them were low, it was there and it was frightening. It didn't end there. Each ring also granted a trait when worn. It was a shame the system was stingy when it came to explanations of traits. From wearing the rings, Seth could make some conclusions. Associate of Darkness was similar to Kin of Fire, making the wearer a favored one of the elements in question. Otherwise, he doubted the range of the domains would have been so big. As for the Nightwalker, it was a more abstract effect Seth could not quite grasp. He guessed it had something to do with the night and maybe the Nyx skill. It would be up to Mina to find out all the little details. The only other notable skills were Curse of a Lover and Shadow Haze. Shadow Haze was a movement skill that allowed partial intangibility against physical attacks. The curse was unfortunately not something fit for battle. Instead, it was something that could ruin the other's life. With a 0,05% chance, it could curse the target with impotence, or sagatits irrespective of race or sex. Seth couldn't resist the horrible image of a young spry man cursed with sagatits. And what about monsters? Would a beast suddenly develop breasts, just for them to become saggy? He came to secretly call the Ring of Nyx Alzalsar's Bane because it was an item that could ruin her life forever. Chapter 651 Happy Misunderstanding. Mina, are you here? I have something for you. Seth returned to the quarters of the Tower Master, looking for his girlfriend. We are in the living room, it came from inside. Entering the living room, he found Mina and Finn sitting on the ground playing games. Seth, you are finally back. Why don't you join us for a game? The little fairy asked eagerly. Sure, why not? With a smile, the blacksmith joined the two, spending some leisure time. Lately, it had been happening more frequently and Seth was quite happy that his everyday life had found a better balance. Giving Mina the rings could wait for later. It was also hilarious how hyped the fairy was about fighting games, despite being really bad at them. Even when Seth was demolishing her mercilessly, she was awed by the character's moves and animations. Mina on the other hand was frighteningly good at first-person shooters. The instincts of an assassin seemed to carry over well into the games, even if Mina had never touched a real sniper rifle. They took food from the kitchen and played until late in the night. Hey Mina, I have something for you. Seth spoke up after Finn finally left and the two got ready for bed. Oh? Did you plan something special for tonight? She asked alluringly as she undressed. It's a present, but there is no reason we can't do both. A present? Her ears stood up in excitement as she looked at him. Seth couldn't help but chuckle at her shift in behavior. From a seductive vixen to an innocent girl looking forward to a surprise. The blacksmith took out the small black box he had prepared for the two legendary rings. Mina's face immediately flushed red when she saw the small box in his hands. WWA she was stammering, with her ears twitching and her eyes unfocused. What is this? He finally got out some words. Of course, your rings. Seth answered truthfully. He knew how much she had looked forward to a legendary item and wanted to surprise her with two. Oh, our rings. This is so quick. You should have asked first. But she kept twitching around nervously. I mean yes, she shouted, with her face red like a tomato. What are you? Seth halted when he looked back and forth between Mina acting weird and the small box in his hand. He felt his face becoming hot as blood shot to his head, making it just as red as Mina's. Seth's thoughts were enshambled. Was this what happened? Did she really think? Would he? Should he have? No, most importantly, she said yes. He was frozen stiff as thoughts ran through his brain. Seeing him petrified with an awkward smile frozen between confusion and happiness, gave Mina the time to realize that something was not quite right. She took the box from his stiff claws and looked inside, finding 2 rings looking like they were forged from pure darkness. These were no wedding bands. And definitely not an engagement ring like she had seen in the media here in Delta. Although it was hardly possible, Mina's head turned even redder, turning a deep crimson. Oh no, she had misunderstood. The Catwoman had unintentionally spearheaded their relationship into new territory. Did she shock him? Did it go too far? What if she pushed him away with this? She quickly turned away with her ears pressed down in embarrassment. She just wanted to get out of this situation. I'm sorry. I will leave, she announced and charged toward the exit door, oblivious to the fact that she was already half naked. However, she felt a big rough hand grasping her shoulder. For a split second the world turned into chaos and she found herself back on the bed. Towering above her was her boyfriend, pressing her onto the bed. No, no, no. No running. What happened to the self-confident vixen I fell in love with? He whispered her in the ear. It made her skin crawl in excitement. There is no taking this back. You said yes. Her heart shuddered when she realized what he meant. She had completely forgotten about the 2 legendary rings. Something much better happened that night. And that is how Mina and I got engaged, Seth announced to the assembled Lord of Mina's March. It was understated to say, that the first reaction was jaws falling to the table and shock before a shower of congratulations rained over the couple. The only person who seemed to be torn was Mike, Mina's brother. Maybe you should take some notes from your sister, Lydia teased Mike and whispered into his ear, which led to the Catman furiously blushing. Whatever she told him, his mood seemed a lot better afterward. Do you already have a date? Jane asked with her eyes shining in excitement. There was no plan and there are no plans, yet, Seth said honestly. No need to rush or anything, Mina said blushing, and leaned against him. Although everything came as a surprise, Mina seemed really happy that things worked out, despite starting as a misunderstanding. Seeing her all smiley and satisfied also calmed Seth's heart. Okay, can we get back to the original topic? The reason for the meeting? Mary asked after an hour of gossiping. Only then did people remember, that Seth technically hijacked the meeting for his sudden announcement. Everyone slowly calmed down and listened to Mary. Everyone good? Finally. Let's start with a request from Princess Lena. It seems that the northern parts of Delta have been recently plagued by tremors and small earthquakes. It seems that scouts have found a bunch of unnatural holes in the mountains to the north. All guilds were asked to send some teams to guard the exploration of these tunnels. So Lena did not ask Minasmar in particular. Not Minasmar, no. She asked if you could come by, Seth. Me? Seth asked confused. Although Seth did not hate her, he had given Lena the cold shoulder since they returned from Sigma. He had not forgotten, that it was her who got his friends into danger. On a logical level, he understood her reasoning, but he wasn't ready to let go of that grudge, yet. Somehow she found out you have a powerful mining skill? At least, that is the official reason mentioned in the request. Will you go? Seth couldn't remember ever mentioning mining to Lena, but he also didn't remember all their conversations. Mining wasn't really a skill he put much emphasis on hiding. It was possible he had mentioned it to her before. But maybe it was also about his golems? He was thinking of an answer when he saw Mina looking at him. Her gaze obviously told him to go and make up with Lena. In the end, it had been them that decided to go into Sigma, even if Lena was the one pushing for it. Kind of being able to read what Mina was worried about, he finally agreed. Although there were less than 2 weeks until their expedition, the most important personnel that would accompany them already had at least one legendary item that would majorly improve their powers and help them stand out. Fine. Sorry, Lydia. You will have to wait for some longer for your personal legendary item. What? Wait a minute? Why me in particular? Lydia asked perturbed. I just started with the bones of Seth and I was going to make yours next. Evie, here's yours. The blacksmith used the chance to push a small black box toward Evie. Inside was the finger of Acheron. Everyone stared at the necklace the immortal witch unboxed. Even if they lacked appraisal skills, the unique aura of a legendary item was hard to ignore for people at a high level. With a smug smile, Mina equipped her pair of rings and displayed them proudly for everyone to see. Some of them already had their legendary items, others had to deal with the weird angel equipment that may turn out to be legendary at some point. Everyone felt like these three made from bones of Seth seemed even more special. You, too? Hey, maybe you could also. Not go? If you think about it carefully, shouldn't your good friend be more important? Lydia stammered jokingly. She already had the angel dagger, but it was hard to find out the use of something that was not yet recognized by the system. Though, if Seth didn't know better, he would have had the misconception that Lydia was salivating at the sight of the legendary jewelry. Don't worry. I will make yours right after returning, he said with a smile, shooting down all her hopes of getting it any earlier. The rest of the meeting was smaller updates on the proceeding of the trade route. Although there were some problems at the frontier, things were proceeding smoothly when it came to the population of Tree Station 1. On that note, Karina had also started working on expanding the other tree station, but without the massive accumulation she had before, they would grow much slower than TS1. However, this was no longer a problem, since the attacks had completely stopped for now after Wolfram blew up their headquarters. The past few days had been peaceful, until Lena's notice. Chapter 652 Shaking Foundations. They arrived at the garrison located at one of the highways leading out of Delta towards the north. This had once been a highway leading toward Omega. Parallel to the streets, one could see the slowly decaying rails of the bullet train that had once run parallel with the highway. The garrison here was built with the arrival of the Krna Empire. Seth heard there were quite a few fortifications built in cooperation with the Empire to protect Delta. Even as the smallest one, Delta was still a massive district holding millions of people. Modern cities weren't built with fortifications in mind, which left a lot of openings for attacks when the danger of an attack from outside became a reality with the start of the apocalypse. Although the district was surrounded by natural barriers, the Empire had helped close these gaps by building garrisons and magic barriers in places like this highway. Once Al-Zalsar's Project Ego was finished, even the airspace would be tightly guarded. But even this could not block everything, as lately tremors had rocked some parts of the northern delta. I'm glad you decided to come, she said a little awkwardly. She had been worked up before and had not realized that their first conversation in weeks had started with her screaming at him. Seth arrived with a team of 10 Oath Guards in relic-rated armor. The field teams 1, 2 and 3 had their own work to do. It was already hard to book good dungeons, so Mina and the others couldn't skip, not after they had already cancelled their reservation last time. This was why Seth brought a team of Oath Guards with him. Aside from them, he had Ceres, Wolfram, the Golem Knights, and a few other available golems on standby in Legion. He didn't call back Tatzel and Puffles, who were on their own adventure with Python somewhere in the mountains. He doubted there was a need for it. Well, you will have your reasons if you request for me personally. But don't misunderstand, the services of the Tower Master of Minasmar are pricey. Seth was not really angry anymore, but he strictly separated business and personal matters. After all, he had left his forge for this. I'm sure you will be satisfied with the work and compensation, she answered confidently. He didn't quite know what that was supposed to mean, but Lena already went off, gesturing for them to follow. After an awkward greeting, she led their team to a big seminar room where they were briefed about the situation. They were not the only team present, the hall held at least a dozen different teams, clearly distinguished by the color of their armor and guild emblems. Although they had used dyes on the armor, Seth could recognize quite a few that had left their workshop. Although Seth didn't make a lot of armor for retail, he was very familiar with Whedon's style. There were also some made by Cerberus, who copied the way Seth worked. The rest of their equipment was made up of roughly matching dungeon items. Although it was not very pretty in most cases, Seth had to acknowledge that these people had done a good job in matching the power of the armor pieces, fitting with their classes. The blacksmith had to admit that individual dungeon equipment could be quite strong, though he was still of the opinion that a loadout, or fully planned out sets, made by a talented blacksmith were better on average. Especially in a world like Earth, where there were no very old dungeons. The young dungeons in Earth had little chance to contain the genuine pearls. In a place like Aura, old dungeons were like oysters. The treasures found were usually not generated by the dungeon from nothing, but the items of previous adventurers that lost their lives in a dungeon. Like an oyster, making a pearl from a grain of sand, the structure would collect and refine them. A mix of a blacksmith's skills and the magic of a dungeon. Depending on the time and initial quality of items, people could even find relic-rated items in old dungeons. Those were the real pearls, the treasures many adventurers would seek by diving into dungeons over and over again. However, those had a hard time appearing on Earth since it had been something barely 3 years since dungeons even appeared. Seth ended his idle thoughts when Lena finally appeared on the rostrum and began to explain why exactly they were even here. We suspect that a group of tunneling beasts have spawned from a portal to the north and started tunneling under Delta's northern border, she explained after a short greeting. According to her explanation, Delta's current protective measures only worked up to 50 meters below the lowest floors of Delta. Since the district and its subterranean levels were built into the solid mountain rock, there would have originally been no problem with just a few tunnels. These countermeasures were primarily so no subterranean beasts tunneled into the city from underground. However, now that some mysterious creatures had started eating massive tunnels into the bedrock below Delta, the structural integrity of the northern parts was endangered, to the point that micro-earthquakes occurred. "Do you have any clues as to what it could be?" one of the other team leaders asked. "We have a few candidates, but our scouts did not enter the tunnels. The worst possible creature we have in mind could be dungeon worms. And that is why you are here, gentlemen." Dungeon worms had only indirect connections to dungeons. They were huge solitary beasts that would gather during the mating season. The group would build a kind of nest in a mountain to hatch and rear their young before scattering again once the young were old enough. They were called dungeon worms because these abandoned nests would often become the seed for new and expansive dungeons to develop. Some of the biggest supermassive dungeons within the Pathworks grew from the abandoned nests of these creatures. She kept showing several diagrams to make sure everyone knew what a dungeon worm looked like. Seth also understood what she meant by the fact that the work would be satisfying. An adult dungeon worm would not be below level 80, which meant it was like the boss of a high-level dungeon in Delta. He was not the only one with glowing eyes when he heard this. "If we are really facing dungeon worms, we cannot risk the lives of our scouts or guards. Simply said, we lack dependable manpower to explore these tunnels. That is why we want you to enter the tunnels and to map them out. The objective is exploration, we don't expect you to fight them. However, if you do fight and subjugate them, you will be rewarded accordingly." She proceeded to explain the rewards. Not only were they paid for their participation in the exploration, information concerning the possible culprit or the confirmation that it was dungeon worms would be rewarded. In case they were right, the reward to subjugate a dungeon worm was 5 gold and they offered to purchase the bodies above market price. The purchase offer and smaller subjugation rewards also extended to other beasts that may be the cause. At this point, not fighting was out of the question for most, especially if it was a dungeon worm they could get the experience and a reward. The teams from the various guilds saw no reason to deny this blessing. Seth wasn't as interested in the rewards, although the experience was tempting, but more so in the fact that Krina was eager to purchase the materials from the dungeon worms. Had these worms a material that even tempted the Empire? After the briefing, they all summoned their mounts, except for Seth, who was riding with one of the Oath Guard on their alpaca. Since his mount and pet were off somewhere else, he didn't really have a choice. They rode off the highway, down into the wild mountains. Lena was not coming personally. Instead they were led by a team of guards and their captain. 3 hours later they arrived in a valley in the north close to Delta. The perfectly circular holes that were penetrating one side of the valley were visible from afar and hard to ignore. As mentioned in the briefing, they all ranged from 3-5 m in diameter. There was more than enough for every team to comfortably choose an entrance without getting in the way of someone else. As the princess has explained, my men and I will set up the camp and wait for your return outside. Please make sure to return in the next 5 to 7 hours, before night falls. While the adventurers were going in to scout, the guard would set up a permanent camp with fortifications for the night. The exploration was expected to take a few days, so they got ready to stay temporarily. It was easier than returning to Delta every day, especially since the mountains outside were still dangerous. If all the adventurer team was traveling independently from Delta to the valley, there was a big chance for unforeseen things to happen. After the guard captain's announcement, the guild teams entered the vast system of tunnels. Seth waited a while longer, deliberating which hole to choose before he finally led the 10 members of the Oath Guard into a hole that was halfway up the mountainside. Chapter 653 Exploring Holes. The team of Oath Guards with him were the new seedlings that were chosen by Jack Felton. They were the most promising bunch with good personalities and could become the members of a possible 4th field team. Get information and follow me closely. The 10 of them were split into a healer, an archer, 2 mages, an assassin, 2 tanks, and 3 melee fighters. Their formation was very traditional, with 2 fighters and the tanks in the front, the long-ranged rearguard in the middle, and one of the dealers in the back in case of an ambush. Although they had come to prove themselves, Seth decided to take the helm and have them follow. The reason was simple: he didn't want to let them take the brunt of the unfamiliar environment. He was the one with the superior mining skill that helped him navigate in a subterranean environment, he was the one with a map skill, and most importantly, he was the one wearing items that improved their chance for a peaceful journey. The tunnels were dark and smooth. Water droplets covered the moist walls and a thin stream of water flowed at the feet. If they had not known it better, they would have thought they were walking through a sewer or a storm drain. Everyone was prepared with an item that granted night vision and did not need any light to find their way in the darkness. They were vigilant, with all their senses strained to the max, but the tunnels stayed quiet. Whenever they came to a cross or partial cross of tunnels with their own, they would mark it with glow-in-the-dark chalk. The mark was a sign allocated to them beforehand, an arrow pointing to the exit, and the approximate distance. This way other teams entering their tunnel would know that someone else came by before and what way was a potential exit for escape. The tunnel grew longer and longer on Seth's map as they wandered through the silent darkness. At some point their tunnel became too steep, so they returned and explored another path from a cross-section. "Oh, would you look at this," Seth exclaimed when he spotted some ore at the edge of the smooth tunnel. "Guys, wait for a moment while I take a sample." At his command, the team of guards formed a protective circle around him. A pickaxe appeared in his hands. It was a shame he had to take apart the one with the Olympian enchantment, this one was a normal substitute made from epic materials. Nothing fancy. With a few swings of the tool, he had cut a niche into the smooth tunnel wall, leaving an obvious gash. Although the blacksmith only intended to take a sample, he found that there were only a few chunks of ore. What had seemed like the start of a vein, was exposed as just a small offshoot of probably a much bigger source. However, he couldn't find any other traces along the tunnel in close proximity. It was really weird. "Is something wrong, Tower Master?" Ortega, the temporary leader of the guard team asked, seeing Seth observe the tunnel. "No, it's all right. Let's continue." "If I am allowed to ask, what did you mine, Tower Master?" Morgana, one of the mages in the group asked curiously. "Just a few chunks of snow copper. Nothing too special, but not too bad either." They wandered for hours, not meeting any living thing nor finding any more signs of ores. Just smooth, dark, winding tunnels. Not meeting any life at all made the heavy, brooding atmosphere even eerier. Alniyat and the cloak of Hecate really shined. After 6 hours in darkness, they left the tunnel system through a different hole from the one they entered. They had mapped out what felt like a good chunk without meeting any danger inside. The only thing that suffered was the team's nerve from staying vigilant for so long. "Don't look so down, this is a good training for when we enter the Holy Land," Seth tried to cheer them up. Not all of the Oath Guard were going to accompany them, but they belonged to the lucky few that were chosen to be nurtured further. Outside they were greeted by the twilight of the evening and the flickering lights of fire in the valley. Where had once stood a group of trees, now stood a group of tents with campfires in between. As they came closer they could already smell the cooking food. The team from Krina had not just sat around, twiddling their thumbs, but had finished setting up their base camp. "Seems like we aren't the first ones to return," one of the team commented. About half of the other teams had already returned, but not all of them had such a quiet day as them. Quite a few had damaged armor and ripped robes, although their wounds had already healed, the dried blood was still visible. "Why are you guys looking jealous? You should be happy we didn't face any danger in there, no matter how much you wish to shine," the Tower Master scolded them, seeing their gaze at the other teams. Leaving the members to their own devices, Seth paid a visit to the mapping table. It was an artifact placed in a tent in the of the camp that allowed for exchange with the map skill. A possessor of the skill could input and share data from his map and synchronize his map with information saved in the table. It was this item that would enable the success of this operation. With everyone's maps synchronized, they could not only organize the actions of the teams based on the data, but the Empire would always have the most up-to-date version of the map as a backup. As the only map holder in their team, this was his task, so Seth fed it their map of the tunnels and also received the stored data from the other teams. When he returned, he found that a couple of the Oath Guards went out to survey the situation in the camp and collect information. Once they returned, they shared what they found out. It seemed like the worst case had come to pass. Although some had met other beasts, most told of their encounters with dungeon worms. The tales the team members brought back sounded a lot worse than Lena's briefing. The people described them as dungeon worms, perfectly fitting the description of the princess. Huge beasts with hide hard as metal and covered in sharp bristles, like swords. burrowing through the stone with incredible speed while their maws ground through the bedrock and their bristles polishes the walls smooth. They wielded an innate magic that could disintegrate rock and ore while swallowing resulting pebbles and sand. Ortega brought back the story of a team that had suddenly heard a quiet rustle that kept swelling and swelling until the tunnel they were in was filled by an ear-shattering roar. Shortly after they saw a myriad of crooked fang break through the tunnel ceiling above, before re-entering the wall on their left side. After moments of staring at the body rushing by, the beast vanished again, leaving a new tunnel half-intersection with their current one. They were lucky that the beast had actually ignored them and they were only hit by debris. Other teams were not as lucky. Some others were unlucky and got hit by the passing beast. The ones that fared the worst were those that actually attacked the creature. Inside the tight tunnel, they tried to fight, but even their strongest attacks had a hard time even putting a scratch into the worm's skin. And the scratches they managed to deliver healed at incredible rates. The only thing they could do was run while being showered in a rain of blade-like bristles. Many of the things they described fit with Lena's briefing on the creatures, but some didn't. Such as the incredible healing and ignoring possible prey. The princess had described dungeon worms as very territorial. It made little sense for them to ignore invaders. What could have caused these changes? Maybe the most concerning part were that some teams had not returned at all. The day slowly came to an end and they returned with these stories. The team got some food from the field kitchen and found the tents that were prepared for them. A bunch of teams returned later than them, some were lucky, and others had suffered. Seth could only frown, seeing the state the teams of the guilds were in. Seeing their condition only made him more careful. Something was not right, he felt it in his gut. It was already late when the blacksmith finally decided to call Lena on the communication orb. It took a while, but she finally answered his call. Chapter 654 Legendary Ingredient. We should stop this quest. There is something wrong with those worms. I'm trying, she answered with a sigh. I have no evidence, but I have a gut feeling that what? I already got the report that something is wrong. My people know more about these beasts than you. If even you can guess that something is wrong, they can do so too, she answered tensely. However, I can't stop this now. What do you mean? Didn't you get full authority over Delta after the evaluation? Officially, yes. It doesn't mean I can do whatever I feel like. You met my brothers, right? Seth nodded. He had a vague memory of the losers of the evaluation. I don't know how, but one of them managed to get the news that there may be a colony of dungeon worms here and reported it to father and the court. And why does that mean that you can't stop this? This quest came directly from the Empire, not from me. I cannot force people to do the quest, but I also can't cancel it on my own, even if there are anomalies. They want this place mapped out, no matter what. If this plan fails, the quest will be published to the public and any stupid fool will be able to throw their life away. I already did my best to restrict the participants to people with the highest survival chance. For some reason, I felt you had the best chance to finish a map. The quicker the map is finished, the quicker this will be solved. Seth just stared at her silently for a while, exploring how he felt about this turn of events. It would end as long as they finished mapping? Before making a decision, he had to follow his suspicion. There is something you didn't tell us about the worms, right? A reason why they would go this far just to have their territory mapped out. Why are they so eager for these worms? Lena's face in the orb looked a little conflicted. Are you alone? What I am about to tell you is confidential. Wait a moment. Seth brought out a ring from his inventory. It was not something he made, because it was one of the many special items that could be dropped in dungeons. Upon equipping and turning it by 90 degrees, it created a soundproof bubble around the wearer. Similar to the robe that could hide one's identity, these were very popular drops from high-level dungeons. Okay, you can speak now. She nodded and continued. Dungeon worms don't just tunnel to build a nest. They feed on ores and systematically consume all metals and precious materials they can find. Their shells are made up of a unique metal composite, their eggs are a unique crystal, but most importantly, as they age, they refine a special crystalline ore in their heart, that is relic rated and can be refined to a legendary ingredient by a master alchemist. Seth's heart had been beating stronger and faster as he listened to her but dropped in disappointment when he heard that the final reason was an ingredient for alchemy, not items. Of course, a legendary ingredient was always something massive, as was proven by Krina's actions. But he was a blacksmith, a goldsmith, an enchanter, and a bard, but not an alchemist. Allison had shown great talent in alchemy, but she had not even entered the craftsman tier, yet. This kind of material was wasted on her. His thoughts straightened after getting over the fact that he would not get his hand on another legendary material. What Lena said explained why Krina was too eager to get their hands on the dungeon worms. Delta's safety was only secondary. Say, after the tunnels are mapped out, what will happen? Krina will send shock troops to take out the worms as quickly and effectively as possible. Alright, let's make a deal. You will explain this to the others and give them an easy way out. I have a way to safely and quickly explore the nest. In exchange, I want part of their hides after your troops took them out. With a way out he meant that she should offer them compensation to give up on the quest. If anyone decided to stay and risk their life afterward, it was not Seth's problem. Lena also thought this was a good solution. But how are you so sure you will be able to do it alone? Seth deliberated for a moment, but since the princess had shown him trust and told him a secret, he decided to reciprocate the gesture. Since you told me a secret, I will also let you in on one. I have a legendary item that grants me safe travels. I and my team have not encountered even one monster on the trip today. You have a legendary item, she exclaimed in shock, quickly suppressing her voice. He only nodded. He wasn't going to correct her and say that he had more than one. Suddenly, her face came really close to the orb, and stared him straight in the face. Listen here, don't let anyone know about this. Only people you trust. If it gets out that there are legendary items on Earth. She whispered but halted. Seth stared at her in surprise. Yes, he asked after she stayed silent for a moment. Shit, let's just say a whole bunch of people will start coming here to try and take it away from you. Currently, Earth is unattractive to smaller forces, but it will get really annoying if the flies start flogging to Earth, or Delta. Make sure this doesn't get out before you reach % and 746. Damn. Just don't tell anyone until you are at a higher level. Seeing the genuine concern in her eyes, Seth only nodded seriously. He had not intended to publish his items to anyone but the gods anyways. Hearing her intense warning, the blacksmith decided to make extra sure word didn't get out. It wouldn't be fun if he was overrun by people who wanted to steal the stuff he originally made to ensure their survival. Whatever Lena tried to say, it was probably about being strong enough to confidently face anyone trying to take his stuff. They didn't talk for much longer after coming to an agreement. Seth was about to say farewell when he suddenly felt a weird vibration in the ground. Perfect pitch caught onto a quiet grinding noise. Say, these worms don't hunt at night, do they? No. A massive shock rocked the camp and a pale blue light flickered across the night sky. The orb still in hand, he ran out of his tent, just in time to see the barrier of the camp react. A blue sphere covering the camp was glowing dimly in the night. Something had crashed into it. He didn't get the chance to riddle what for long. Outside the barrier surfaced a terrible beast from the earth. Longer than Puffles and with a diameter of 5 meters even girthier than the eye visor, it was a dungeon worm covered in sword-like bristles. Blood was flowing from a quickly closing laceration above its mouth filled with crooked teeth. The angry beast bashed against the glowing barrier with a might that shook the whole camp. Other teams and guards also rushed out of their tents to stare at the beast attacking the camp. Every clash made their hearts beat faster, but the barrier held. Gaining confidence in their defense, the inevitable happened. Let's go! A battle cry echoed through the night and several parties started attacking the beast. Seth was unable to clearly see its level with his observation, which meant it was probably above level 90. Thirsting the experience, several teams jumped into the fray, to attack the giant worm. The members of the Oath Guard, clad in full armor, came running over. Tower Master! Ortega called out to him, leading his team members. What are you doing? Are we not going, too? Ortega asked surprised. Do you think we can gain much with this many high-level people hacking a single mob to bits? We should use this to get an idea about the strength of a dungeon worm. Ortega halted when he heard what Seth said. He was right. It was different if they could monopolize one beast, but if the whole camp jumped at them. They gained more if they just watched on. It was not just them. Especially the people who looked a little worse for wear after returning, showed no signs to jump into the fight. It became obvious as the fight went on for a while. Although they were all from different guilds, they managed to form a loose cooperation, not getting into each other's ways. The tanks hindered the movements of the creatures, while the others attacked. The sword-like bristles blocked normal attacks and the hide was like metal, only taking small damage. In exchange, quite a few were hurt and impaled by the bristles shooting at them. Quickly they turned to attack from afar, from behind the tanks wearing heavy armor. In loosely organized ranks, they started their raid on the beast. Chapter 655 Not Supposed to Be. Blood gushed from deep gauges as the skills and spells of the adventurers rained on the beast. But no matter how many wounds they slashed, there were no signs of the fight slowing down. While the teams were exhausting themselves slashing at the immortal Nightcrawler, others were watching in shock as the beast kept healing. However, Seth was in a stupor for a different reason. The spirit blacksmith was unable to make out a soul in the beast. So far he had always been able to see the souls, or the traces of a soul using soul capture. He was unable to do so this time. Seeing a living, moving creature lacking a soul caused an unfamiliar and deeply disturbing sensation in him. It hit him harder than he would have expected. He was okay with golems having no soul, but when it came to other beings, even the undead had souls. But this wasn't an undead, it was clearly alive, a living being moving without a soul. What happened to it? How was it alive without one? The beast's movements and regeneration finally started to slow down, after several hours of the siege. The adventurers did not get away unharmed. In the end, most people present in the camp had to join the fight to drive the beast into a corner. When the fight finally came to an end, the creature looked like it was dismantled alive. Only when almost half its body mass was destroyed, did it stop moving and regenerating. Cheers broke out in the night, as the exhausted adventurers celebrated their hard-fought for victory. Seth only felt even more confused. It seemed like there was nothing wrong with the experience they had gained, despite the creature lacking a soul. What was going on? Are you still there, Lena? Yes. Don't tell me these things are supposed to be this strong. They are not. The blacksmith could hardly ask her about the missing soul without revealing his skill, but he was sure it had something to do with it. Can you get me the guard captain? Lena used the chance to take the next steps quickly. Since she had seen everything with her own eyes and everyone was already assembled, she wanted to have a meeting right away to talk about the changes. She didn't reveal what Seth and she had talked about but used the raid on the worm and the missing teams as an excuse to cancel the quest. The objective of finding out what caused the tunnels were cleared and everyone was promised a compensation for canceling the quest. Although badly damaged, Krina also purchased the body of the Knight's worm above market price to investigate it. We have to investigate the anomalies first. Before that, we can't ask you to risk your lives in this way. You will be contacted once the investigation is finished and informed whether the quest resumes or not. She finished the meeting. The teams were scheduled to stay the rest of the night and set off on their way back to Delta in the morning. Until then they were questioned whether they noticed anything weird during the fight. Most had nothing valuable to say, but some mentioned that it was not simply called a dungeon worm, but its name had a bunch of characters attached to it, though they could not quite say what they meant. In the morning, only the people of Krina and Minas Mar stayed in the camp, except for some escorts that guided the teams on their way to Delta. With the guilds of Delta gone, only Seth and his team were left to map out the tunnel system. As confident as the blacksmith felt in his armor and the ability to travel safely, he had been spooked by the sight of the raid on the soulless beast. If things had not moved so quickly, he may have been willing to cancel his offer. Seth was one of the people that would proudly accept being called a coward. There was nothing important at stake for him, so he saw no reason to risk his life. Previously, he had thought of mapping the tunnels out personally, but now, well, he still had to go in person, but he was going to be more careful about it. The guard looked on in confusion as he released a swarm of scout golems into the tunnels. If this could fill the map of the map skill, Krina would have done it from the start. Items that could interact with system skills were rare and hard to make. Seth had heard that the few people able to make items such as the very precious map table needed to fulfill high requirements, of which the lowest were to be a master enchanter and a high-ranking member of the system church with a priest class. The blacksmith had no chance to fulfill such requirements, which was why this was not his intent in the first place. The golems were sent on a reconnaissance mission. They would find and tail the individual worms. This method would not be of any help to Krina when hunting them, but it was a great help for Seth to avoid them. Since he could sense his golems, he would be able to evade the worms, while running full speed through the tunnels. He knew that Alniyat worked from the other day, and he was going to raise the speed significantly. Although the legendary armor piece could manipulate his chance to meet danger, he had no idea how well it worked if he ran into danger with his current speed. Seth had only gotten a glimpse of what he was currently capable of, but if he concentrated on just running, he felt like he could outrun a car in the city. Half an hour after the swarm of golems went in, the bard checked his equipment and went to one of the yet-to-explore entrances. He had updated his map earlier to make sure he would not do any redundant work. He equipped Antares, immediately being covered in a skin-tight barrier, and held the shield in front of his chest. The next moment he was gone from the eyes of the spectators. Only the quick staccato of his step echoes from the entrance and quickly grew quieter in the distance. Seth had trained semi-diligently to be accustomed to his speed in battle, but he had never really tested the limits. The unnatural smooth and round nature of the tunnels, together with his speed, made it feel like an old video game. As if he was a spaceship, flying through a gorge, just without evading obstacles or collecting power UPS. Continuously increasing his speed, he quickly noticed that he wouldn't be able to deal with the speed, without the 3D maneuver assistance. Especially bends, or sudden dead ends threatened to put an abrupt stop to his speed run of the dungeon worm nest. The activation of 3D maneuver assistance released him from two-dimensional movements. Still, curves with almost 90 degrees angles in any direction, would have probably broken his legs or joints, if it was for the 80% damage reduction. On longer stretches, he would open and check the map to check his progress. He tried to check the map and the position of his golems as often as possible, to make sure he wasn't going to run into the worms. The beasts did disturb him, but this was not the reason he evaded them. He could beat them, but the consequences were a big loss. The easiest solution he had to deal with them was to get Wolfram to turn them into metal. However, similar to the other methods he could think of, it would make the reason to hunt them completely obsolete. The materials would be lost, or so damaged they lost their use. Whether this was just an excuse so he wouldn't have to face something that disconcerted him, who knows. After 2 hours of running, he found that the golems were congregating in a single place. What was going on? After deliberating for a moment, the blacksmith gave in to his curiosity and followed the signals of the golems to see what was going on. Chapter 656 Moving with the Tail. Incredulous, he stared down into a giant cavern. It was a natural cavern, with huge columns, stalagmites and stalactites. If not for the situation, he may have felt like looking at the place longer. Judging from the rest of the network of tunnels, this seemed like the central chamber. Although he was still missing some parts of the maze, this seemed obvious, when looking at the three-dimensional model of the map, which had surprisingly reached Leave 5 after constantly being used over the past hours. The raving bodies of dozens of worms were entangled at the bottom below. It gave him yucky vibes, similar to the time-mating lake of Titanoboas. His small golems were flying in the air above, like small fireflies. Despite the hair-raising sight of naked, worm bodies with sharp bristles, the blacksmith's eyes lit up when he spotted something sparkling at the back of the cavern. He brought out a tablet to share the vision of one of the scout golems, and have it inspect the place. In a smaller cavern, connected to this one, he found 3 eggs. They were about the size of an ostrich egg, with a bright, crystalline shell that sparkled even in this darkness. These had to be the eggs Lena mentioned, with the unique crystal shell. The blacksmith had no difficulties making his next decision. The eggs were not part of his deal with Krina, so unless he took them himself, he wouldn't get any. He was sure there were only 3 because the worms had just started mating not long ago. Krina's teams wouldn't miss these 3 when these dozens of worms started to laying them in droves, right? It wasn't even so much the material that intrigued him, but the chance that came with the eggs. The worms were great in tunneling, they were a source of unique materials, and even had the chance to contain something naturally relic-rated, even if it was not a material he could use. With Evan and his blessing of husbandry, it would be outright criminal not to try and breed these creatures. Even if they were not pretty, they seemed more than useful enough. The decision to take the eggs was made in a heartbeat. Although he lost the set effect, Seth took off Laroeg and equipped the Helm of Hades, which he was still unable to appraise. With a combination of 3D maneuver assistance and star escape, Leave 1 traveled across the ceiling using the natural stalactites and columns. It wasn't easy without the Laroeg point. If worn completely, Seth could freely teleport to any of the star positions, which were depicted on a plane parallel to the soles of his boots. The start point was always Pipirima, located in the middle of the constellation. However, missing Laroeg that was directly in front of Pipirima, he also lost connection to most of the other points in front. Which meant he had to do several twists and turns in the air to use the tail of the scorpion to get forward. He somehow managed to make it to the other side without puking. When he was right above the entrance to the egg chamber, he took a break to calm down, before letting himself fall down. It was a 20m drop, easily, but he felt almost nothing when he struck the superhero landing. Damage reduction and feather fall made him fearless of fall damage. Eggs were living things and could not enter the inventory. This would have been a problem if this happened a couple of weeks before, but now the 3 eggs happily joined his golems in legion. With his spoils of war safely stored away in the pocket space, he returned to the main chamber. Now he realized the error of his ways. He should have fixed a rope to the ceiling before letting himself fall down. His stomach dropped, when he faced the maneuvers the assistant's overlays suggested to get back to the ceiling. For just a moment he considered switching helmets but didn't in the end. Although he was sure his face had a tinge of green by the time he was back at the tunnel he entered from, he didn't take the risk to get spotted. He didn't feel like doing Krina's work for them. After getting some distance from the central chamber he switched back to Laraig and began retreating at breakneck speed. After getting a good distance, he brought out his communication orb and called the princess. "Seth? Did something happen?" "No, well yes. I'm pretty much done and found the central chamber and their nest. Although there are still some loose ends in the tunnels, that should be the main information you wanted, right?" "You already?" Lena fell silent for a moment. "Yeah, I think I can work with that. Just get out of there now." As expected, the princess quickly understood why Seth had called her. Since he already got the most important information he technically fulfilled the quest already. He just wanted to check back with her to make sure, before leaving the tunnels. With all the worms doing whatever they were doing back there, he didn't even want to think about what exactly it was, he was free to choose the shortest way out. Excited that his plan had worked and he managed to finish the quest without any incidents, Seth sped to the exit, always making sure that the worms stayed where they were. He only started slowing down when he saw the light of day outside. The blacksmith enjoyed the sun greeting him with its warming rays. His mood was great, for about 0,5 seconds until he heard the noise of battle. The camp was laid to waste. A group of guards and the team of Oathguard were fighting an abomination. A dungeon worm had entered the barrier, but it didn't look quite right. Seth's brain needed a moment to understand what he was looking at. This was the dead worm from yesterday, however, it was far from dead. In horror, he realized that the holes and cuts in the beast's flesh were filled with other flesh. Human limbs, faces, and skin were fused to the worm's hide, having an eerie resemblance to the abominations of Kavati Koinen. Currently, there were 5 people from the guard team left, keeping the beast at bay together with the 10 members of the Oath Guard. Seth hurried but found that his intervention may not even be needed. Having watched the fight last night, especially Ortega and his team were able to hold their ground without much difficulty. Compared to the night before, the worm was now much slower, although many holes were patched, it had not regained its former strength. The tankers clad in relic armor held it back, while the attackers and mages covered it in spells and skills. Last night it had collapsed once enough damage was accumulated. The blacksmith decided not to step in and watch to make sure nothing untoward happened instead. There was a sense of pride, seeing his people being this capable with his items. Dealing with a situation the united forces of the Guild of Delta had a hard time with. Yes, the worm was weakened, but Seth didn't care. They deserved to finish this fight themselves. He didn't know how the beast was alive again, but he wasn't going to snipe their experience points. Seth stayed some distance away from the fight and kept observing the battle and the situation of the worms. The worm that returned to life had already destroyed the barrier of the camp from the inside. If one of the other worms showed signs to leave the central chamber and come their way, he was ready to intervene. The fight wasn't short, taking another hour after Seth's arrival before the creature finally croaked and stopped moving. The guards of Krina that were left collapsed on the floor, while the Oath Guards were breathing heavily, but didn't dare to sink to their knees. "Tower Master. I'm sorry we couldn't." He made the knight stop talking with a hand gesture and consequently ignored his attempt to apologize. "Well done guys. Especially you Ortega. Even in such a long fight, you kept a clear head. Very admirable." Seth finally came over, giving praise where he thought it was due and also a little critique here and there. He wasn't going to play a big expert, but he had some amount of experience with a bunch of experts, so he was able to say one thing or another that would help them later on. "I don't think anyone here will refuse to leave, right?" The camp was destroyed, the quest done and everyone but Seth was terribly exhausted. The day was already getting darker, but everyone agreed that it was better to quickly return to Delta, even if they had to travel through the night. They would have more than enough time to talk about what happened here on the journey. Chapter 657. Any wounded? Ortega had been a little depressed, seeing how the tower master had not taken them along. He knew this was because the master was worried about them, but Ortega could not help feeling that he didn't trust their abilities. He and his team had come with the expectation to be able to shine in front of the tower master, the man who had enabled him to live a good life in these kinds of times. Not meeting any monsters on day 1 and being left behind on day 2 was depressing. The knight was not alone in his feeling, as the whole team had a gloomy atmosphere all day. Hearing the tower master not just praise them, but also give them individual advice after such a long battle really touched them. Especially Ortega's worry was alleviated. If Seth didn't trust in their strength, would he have just stood by and watched? He was sure that the blacksmith could have ended the fight at any point, but he not only trusted their strength but also allowed them to monopolize the experience points. Although exhausted, they were in a much better mood, feeling like they got their chance to shine in front of the tower master in the end. With the decision to leave made, they hurried to pack up their stuff and summon their mounts. "Tower master, shouldn't we bring this back?" Morgana asked with the glint of curiosity typically for many wizards. "Heck no. Who knows when it becomes active again? I will burn it here and now." "You can't. We need to bring it back to research it and come up with a countermeasure." It was one of the guards from Krina, actually, it was the very dilapidated-looking guard captain in charge of the camp. He managed to be one of the last 5 survivors of the guard team. A testament to his strength, not necessarily his wisdom. "I don't know what exactly happened in the camp while I was away, but it's pretty obvious that this thing absorbed people to heal itself. Do you really want to bring it to a place with a lot of people to absorb in case it gets away?" "I know very well that it absorbed people, they were our comrades. We have to retrieve their bodies," the captain insisted, still unconvinced. "I can call Lena about this. I just spoke with her not too long ago." He raised the communication orb to show his readiness to bring the captain's superior into this debate. The blacksmith didn't know which was the real reason as to why the captain wanted to bring the thing along, but one thing was clear, Seth wasn't going to take that thing back, even if the princess herself insisted to do it. "I'm sure your friends would rather be incinerated and know that their killer was gone for good than take the risk of becoming part of it and doing to others what happened to them." When he added that, the guard captain finally fell silent. After a moment of grimacing, he gave his consent with an unwilling nod. His fists were balled tightly, but his face was resolute. With a wave of his hand, a circle of bright pale blue fire surrounded the giant corpse and soon grew to a great pillar that lit the surroundings. The lighter human tissue quickly turned to ashes, but to Seth's shock, the dungeon worm's flesh did not. The spirit flame burned brightly in the twilight of the ending day, but the corpse resisted the terrifying heat vehemently. The floor started liquefying, while the body was merely scorched on the surface. It was the first time the blacksmith faced something organic that withstood the spirit flame. When he stopped supplying the fire with power, it immediately went out instead of burning on like usual. Seth ignored the stares of the team and stepped closer to the remains. A beast that had no soul and whose remains seemed almost immune to the flame of the underworld. It was just too weird. Maybe it just had a high fire resistance? Thinking this, he switched to the draconic titan flame, the fire next best in damage. Although he couldn't quite put his finger on it, the titan flame seemed to burn the corpse slightly quicker, but not as fast as expected. It did have a good resistance to fire, probably because it was a beast of the earth, with a body that was mostly made up of stone and metal compounds. But, that didn't explain why the spirit flame worked less than the titan flame. Following a hunch, he also used Phlegathon's fire. The flame was dark and murky, even darker and oppressing than the draconic titan flame. He found that it had the greatest effect on the corpse. Though it didn't burn the corpse, it slowly melted it. The worm's mutilated body turned into a puddle of molten slag. "Tower Master?" Ortega asked worriedly. Maybe it was his expression that made him worried. Seth controlled his face and mounted an alpaca. "Everything's all right. Let's set off and quickly return to Delta." They were not blessed with the calm journey they hoped for. They had been on the move for just over an hour when they suddenly saw a signal flare shoot across the sky. After exchanging a quick look, Seth and the guard captain changed course to see who shot the flare. A few kilometers off their original route they found a party camping out in a gorge. It had a tight entrance but widened to the back where it ended in a short cave. "Hey, aren't you the party from the Boulder Guild?" Seth exclaimed when he saw some familiar faces. He knew none of them personally, but he had seen their faces around Marcel, Elsa, and Brock during the evaluation. The man standing at the mouth of the gorge greeted them and spoke to Seth. "Yes, I'm Rourke from the Boulder Guild. Tower Master, it's our first time talking personally, which makes the situation even more regretful. I have to ask you to stay there and answer some of my questions before I can let you in. Didn't you light the signal flare to ask for help? The captain inquired. Yes, but this and that are related. Did any of you get hurt in the fight with the worm last night? He asked this question especially to the guards of Krina, even though their slightly bedraggled appearance was more than enough answer. The Oath Guards' relic-rated armor and weapons didn't show many signs of use, while the Krina guards had suffered visibly in comparison. Not last night, the guard captain said indignantly. Just like Seth and the others from Minas Mar, the guard from Krina had not actively joined the parties in their raid on the worm. However, they were forced to fight the resurrected beast not too long ago. Not last. The thing somehow revived in the morning and laid waste to the base camp. They and Ortega's team fought the resurrected creature earlier, Seth explained. The man grimaced when he heard that. And were your people wounded? Seth looked at his back, but the members of the delegation from Minas Mar just shook their heads. Then I have to ask the guards to stay outside, for everyone's safety. Why? The captain asked seriously. Seth also looked at Rourke curiously. It seemed like something had happened. I will explain. Rourke started telling them what happened after their departure for Delta. At first everything was fine, but when we were just an hour away from Delta, some among the group started acting strange. Several people started convulsing and fell off their mounts. As the group turned back to help, more and more lost control of themselves. When helpers arrived, they suddenly attacked them. As if they had lost their minds, they started attacking with weapons or bare hands. It was chaos, with many first helpers being caught off guard and losing their lives, he described depressed. Okay, but what had that to do with us? The captain insisted. I will show you, follow me while I keep explaining. With that, he started leading them away from the entrance to the gorge. At first we still tried to solve it without using force, but healing magic had no effect and it also wasn't like they had contracted any status effects. In the end, we were forced to fight only to find out that they had the same unnatural healing as the worm did. They turned around a corner, facing a steep rock face. Seth's eyes widened in shock and he could hear the captain beside him breathe in surprise. By the time we resolved ourselves to fight seriously, many of us had already been injured and not fit to fight. We could only flee. This is what happened later, with to those that got injured. The place Rourke had led them to was a steep rock wall, with roughly 20 people tied to it with magic rope. Their ankles and hands were bound, but they were snarling and struggling like rabid beasts that were trying to break their chains. Chapter 658 Order 44. Their skin was pale, with an unnatural grey tone and the sclera of their bulging eyes was yellow, the color of pus. With hunger in their sick eyes and spittle flowing from their growling mouths, they struggled against their bonds, trying to charge at them. What is going on? Ortega exclaimed in shock. The guard captain's face had turned to stone. He had more experience in these situations and had already made the connection. He cursed in a tongue even Seth couldn't understand with universal translation. However, the captain was not even most disconcerted about the situation. It was the spirit blacksmith who failed to see their souls. They were people he had seen just yesterday, and now they looked like nothing more than human objects. Seth didn't know why exactly he felt this disturbed, but it was almost like a primal threat he could not suppress. Still, he didn't take his eyes off of the creatures that were once human. We believe it's a disease that is transmitted through direct injuries by the infected. You mean a zombie plague? Ortega commented bluntly. Yeah, if it makes you feel better to call it that, Rourke admitted. Wouldn't it be better to put them out of their misery? Anga, the healer of the team of Oath Guards, asked hesitatingly. It wouldn't work. At first, we suppressed and bound those that turned in case there was a cure. Some tried to end their lives out of their own volition, but it didn't work, they simply turned quicker and healed back. Did you call Delta and report about this? Has anyone used Hone Call to return to Delta? Seth asked when he finally managed to pull himself together. Rourke had mentioned that they fled, this meant somewhere out there was a big group of high-level things hunting for prey. If they reached Delta. But even worse if someone returned to the city and turned there, this would be. We understood the risk, so we deliberately didn't use home call, in case we still turned later. However, I can't guarantee nobody used it in the chaos. We couldn't call Delta, since our phones don't work out here. Rourke answered. You have no communication orb. We have nothing that fancy. Seth ignored his comment and quickly called Lena with his orb. It took a while before someone answered. Seth. What is going on? She asked in a hectic tone. Just calling to warn you about a rabid crowd of human-shaped beasts possibly coming your way. Too late. The border fort has already engaged in battle with a group of people that look suspiciously similar to the guild teams we send out. What happened? She asked when she heard Seth and the other curse the moment she said that they were already engaged in combat. The blacksmith handed the orb to Rourke and asked the man to explain it the same way he had explained it to them. Lena's face in the orb turned visibly serious as the member of the Boulder Guild explained. I will take the appropriate steps. You guys stay where you are for now. Please tell Captain Gardy to follow Order 44, she finally said seriously, but she looked really tired. With that, she ended the call. When the captain, Gardy, heard the order his face turned pale, but he nodded seriously. He excused himself and went back to his men. Say, which of them were the ones that rather wished to end it? Seth finally asked when Rourke attempted to return with them to the gorge. Why do you ask? I want to try and give them the peace they sought after. This sounded nice, but what Seth really wanted to do was to experiment and try to find a way to effectively end these things before they could harm anyone he actually cared about. Their existence also really irked him. It was better for everyone and his peace of mind if he found a way to kill them effectively. Slightly hesitant, Rourke showed him a group of people that were bound slightly differently. They had been hastily bound once Rourke and his people saw that they regenerated after death. Once he had shown the place, Seth asked the others to return first, so he could concentrate on testing things. With that Rourke, and the Oath Guards returned to the camp of the Boulder Guild, while Seth tuned to the bound people and looked for a way to grant them peace. Delta. The lights illuminating the nightly battlefield suddenly turned from a bright white to a sickly orange. Curses could be heard from the soldiers locked in battle with the former adventurers turned rabid beasts. They all knew what the orange light meant. An announcement echoed from the walls of the fort in the back over the battlefield for everyone to hear. To all combat personnel. Please note that Protocol 44 is now in effect. Cells for the immediate self-isolation upon return have been prepared. Protocol 44, measures to be taken when facing a highly contagious disease in a foreign world. The fact they prepared isolation chambers meant they were currently facing an enemy afflicted by a disease that was immune to ordinary system skills. From one moment to the next, the soldiers knew that they might be just moving corpses. Depending on the disease and its effects, there was little chance of a cure or survival. However, to all combat personnel, please note, infection is assumed to be caused through wounds. It is advised to avoid injuries at all cost or amputate any injured area as soon as possible, if possible. There was a slight hope, for some of them. The announcements had an obvious effect on the battlefield. About a third of the soldiers started fighting much more carefully, slowly retreating to the wall. The other two-thirds became wilder, fighting with reckless abandon. They had already been injured. At this point, they knew there was little hope for them. This was why they fought harder, to protect the comrades that still had a chance and take revenge for their own sealed fate. Order 44, one of the most dreaded announcements as it could mean the wipeout of a whole population and could even threaten the pathworks. They rather chose to die in this battle, than to suffer whatever symptoms an Order 44 disease had. The battle raged all night long. At dawn, the field and highway leading out of Delta, past the fort, was covered in blood and dismembered bodies. The rays of morning light fell on the few soldiers still standing. Only then exited a new team of people from the fortified gate of the fort. Clad in white overalls, not unlike modern hazmat suits, and wearing various versions of beaked masks, came the executives of Order 44, the doctors. Using magic and items, they bound the last soldiers so they would be unable to move. On the other hand, a vast number of them started hurriedly collecting the corpses that had finally stopped regenerating. They did not put them in their inventories, but in huge jars, as big as a person, that were sealed with powerful spells once filled. Even if the corpses could reanimate and regenerate, they would be unable to assemble and get out of the reinforced containers. It didn't stop with collecting the body parts, there were even doctors that used spells and abilities to collect the blood and bodily fluids that had tainted the earth. After the bloody and chaotic battle of the night, seeing the people in white professionally and quickly cleaning the battlefield in a matter of hours was calming and disturbing for any onlooker. It was calming because they felt reliable. But it was disturbing how practiced they were in cleaning the battlefield in this manner. The people on the walls were simple soldiers, some recruited from Delta, but most had received the blessing of the system god and were only stationed here temporarily. This was the first time they saw the doctors in action, but it filled them with fear to think about how often the doctors had to take action like this. The Pathworks had a myriad of worlds, each with its own plethora of dangerous diseases. While the few Ori-Humas of Delta were shocked by just this disease, the soldiers who had seen many worlds knew how terrifying Order 44, measures to deal with a disease that could threaten the Pathworks, really were. Seeing the doctors this practiced, made them question how often they or their home world had evaded total extinction because these people did their job right. Chapter 659 Quarantine. Are you sure you can deal with this? Seth asked the princess in person. Early in the morning, they had gotten the call, that the situation at Delta had been taken care of. Captain Gardy and his men stayed behind at the gorge, bound, while the team of the Boulder Guild and Minasmar returned to Delta using home call. The doctors are experts in the containment of alien diseases. We are also checking the teleportation registries from last night, to see if someone arrived. If someone returned with home call last night, they will find and check them, the princess reassured. Although she looked tired, the confidence swinging in her voice made Seth actually believe that things were in good hands, for now. Thanks, Lena. Do you still need the map data? The blacksmith took out the core of the map table, that Captain Gardy had entrusted to him. This was the heart of the device that stored the map data from the map skill. The fact that it was the only thing the guard captain had salvaged from the camp before their departure, showed how precious these kinds of items were. It won't hurt having it. Thank you, Captain Gardy. Ding. You have finished the quest, explore the nest. Experience gained. Gold gained. Hearing the notification, he took a glance at his status to see that his experience had jumped to just over 50% of level 72. He had gained roughly 40% of the experience needed for a level up. He also got 15 gold as a reward. If these quests were not so exhausting, he may have thought of doing more. The captain and the other 4 guards bound themselves and stayed with the other individual at the temporary camp of the Boulder Guild. I put the location into the core, too. Good, we will send a group of doctors to take care of them. Will you return to Minasmar right away? Seth nodded seriously. They parted ways soon after and the blacksmith returned to Minasmar quickly using the church's teleport hub. Seth. Are you okay? Mina immediately cried out, hugging him tightly. I'm fine, and so are the others. Did you follow my orders? Yes, Minasmar has entered quarantine, Mary answered his question from the side. His call with Lena was not the only one the blacksmith made that night. He had explained the situation to Mary and asked her to pull out all of their members from Delta, similar to when they celebrated. While the administrative staff was now staying in their business building on the surface, the Oath Guards and other inner members had assembled in Mina's march. Seth didn't intend to take any risks. Even if Lena was able to deal with the current incident, this wasn't over. The fact that the infection originally came from a monster outside, meant that this disease could spread rampantly outside of Delta, even if the princess was able to prevent or contain cases within the city. Literally, anyone going outside could come back infected. With home call anyone was able to directly enter the heart of the district. Even if this function was somehow blocked, there were more than enough ways for someone to enter Delta unseen. Maybe the disease was already in the city and nobody knew. If you really want to go through with it, Minasmar will be able to operate self-supporting. We can easily sustain ourselves with produce from the herb gardens and our current storage. But what about the expedition to the Guild's Holy Land? Let's not make a decision yet and observe how things are developing in Delta first. Alright, but there is another problem we need to discuss. We are getting more and more reports of monster encounters on the trade route. The trade route, or tree route as it came to be called. At this time, it had changed quite a lot from the original design. Originally, it was just planned as a line of waypoints protected by trees, or golems if people were present, that led from Y City to Delta. Even though it was cut short at Mount Agra because of the changes in Epsilon, it had only grown past their expectations. With the gradual expansion of the tree stations and expeditions of Delta spreading towards the southwestern mountain range, traffic had already boomed. But it wasn't just people from Delta, traders and merchants from Y City still made their way to the mountain city from where they traveled the tree route. According to recent reports, the number of monsters appearing keeps increasing. This had been a common theme ever since Earth was synchronized with the Pathworks. Although settlements like the tree stations and districts like Delta were safe, the number of portals that opened in the wild had gradually increased, filling the no man's land with monsters. Even if the golems of the tree stations regularly went out to cull beasts, travelers still had a rising chance of meeting dangerous beasts on the road. We need a higher presence out there, Mary insisted. It was not just keeping the way between the tree stations safe, but also the stations themselves. With the rising population in these places, they also needed people to police them and keep order in the cities. The laws of the old world were a blessing and a curse, depending on what side one stood on. It was a curse to Delta, as district forces were not allowed to operate outside of the districts except under special circumstances. The forces Delta had been able to grow under the protection of Krna were confined to the district. This was a blessing for any entrepreneur intending to operate outside of the districts. There were no taxes to pay or laws to obey in the no man's land. Just like when Minasmar decided to mine any resources they could get their hands on. It was first come, first served, and whoever had the biggest fist was in the right. Another reason why Seth intended to keep his fists as big and meaty as possible. Another effect of this was, that people who settled in the wild, were responsible for themselves. It was Minasmar's responsibility to keep up the semblance of law and order in their tree stations, and they couldn't expect anyone else like the police of Delta or guards from Krna to keep public order. It was just another worry added. They had the people necessary. The Chimeras, the Oath Guard, the new Fair, though they still needed to grow a little. The problem was the disease. After doing his own tests, he knew that it had something to do with the soul, and he couldn't know whether it could even affect the Fair, or his golems. He first needed a countermeasure for it. Did Al also come in? He interrupted Mary. Yes. She wanted to meet you, too, she answered a little surprised. All right, let's postpone this topic for now. I want to have a talk with her first. If things go well, I am sure we can solve all of that soon. You've come. Took you a while. What are you talking about? I've been back for like an hour and rushed here as soon as possible. Seth omitted that he had taken some time to have a meal with Mina and the others after postponing their talk. Anyway, I know the timing isn't great, but I have been meaning to talk to you about this since the last time we met, she said with a conflicted expression. You are leaving. Seth detonated the bomb before the sorceress even had the time to set a timer. He wasn't dense, even if he often decided to ignore the signs for his own peace of mind. How did you know? Just guessing. You finished what I asked of you. You managed to solve the problem with your body. Don't think I forgot that you are the great sorceress who still has unfinished business with a dragon. It was just a matter of time. I guess it was rather obvious. I came to explain how ego and the production of Ithilden work and give you control over the systems before I leave. You are leaving so soon? Seth asked, a little surprised. He didn't expect it to go this quickly. Well, I had been wanting to tell you earlier but didn't get the chance. I spent the time looking for clues about the lizard. I recently found out where he might be, so I will go to search for it. They both fell silent for a moment. Seth needed some time to find the right wording. It's great that you managed to find some clues. Although I feel sad you are going to leave, I hope you can fulfill your goal and find what you are looking for. Her glare was stabbing him with doubt. She didn't expect him to be so supportive, which just made her suspicious. Don't misunderstand this as an attempt to keep you here, but, could you help me with something one last time before leaving? He asked awkwardly. I knew it. Chapter 660 Ego. It's not much, really. I just need your help to modify this formation. The blacksmith hurriedly explained and pulled out the schematic for a formation. Alzalsar's pupils constricted when she saw the formation. She pondered for a moment. The soul banishment formation? Is that the one you got from those guys that tried to kill the stone giant? She asked seriously. Soul banishment? Wasn't it soul eradication? The blacksmith asked, confused. That's what they called it, but now that I see it, this is different. Although they inevitably lead to the same cause of death by evicting the soul from the body, they work much differently. One destroys the soul, like your soul flame. The other cuts the bond of soul and body and whisks it away. Anyway, can you modify it into something like a barrier? You don't mean something like a person goes through and loses its soul kind of a deal, do you? Why would you want something that nasty? It's the only thing that worked effectively against the infected, he admitted and took out his phone while explaining what exactly happened on the quest. The blacksmith had a wolfram film all his experiments on the bound infected. Seth tried to burn them with every fire he could use and the effects were only slightly better than with the worm. They burned, but they also regenerated at high speeds. Only his two flames from the underworld were able to deal somewhat lasting damage, but even that only took longer to heal. He also tried Ravenous Sog and other soul armaments to some success. The only two options that truly ended things for good were Wolfram's transmutation to metal and this very soul banishment. Wolfram's transmutation was unique to the golem and other items made from the Angel of Chains. The only thing easily reproducible was the formation, but it took longer to set up and only affected what was inside. This was why Seth hoped Al could help to make it more functional. The video showed the blacksmith laboriously setting up the formation around the man, which was bound by wrists and ankles. Once it was finished and activated by supplying it with magic power, it took only a few moments for the rabid, struggling man to fall silent. The great sorceress frowned when she saw this result. The video showed the lifeless man for several more minutes after the formation was deactivated. It did not move anymore. This is weird. It should take a lot longer to banish a human soul, she gave her expertise. You know, if you showed this to the people from Krina, they could have done the rest themselves. Why come to me? Mostly because I don't want to explain stuff? It's one thing if I swagger along with the sudden knowledge of souls and even a soul banishment formation from some random kingdom in the path works. It's something much more believable if the great sorceress comes along with a ready-made solution, don't you think so? Fine, I will help you one last time before leaving. You wouldn't happen to have brought one of those infected along with you? Of course, you didn't. Don't worry, this can work with the video. Let's go to the lab. The two went to one of the facilities that lay idle most of the time. The only person that would visit once in a while was Evie. They were the laboratories specialized to work on enchantments. Minas Mar was a magician tower, after all, it was just that they lacked enchanters. But do you really lack something you don't need? All three blacksmiths working in Minas Mar were able to use their kind of enchantment. There was no enchanter in Delta, at the standard Minas Mar needed and willing to come under someone's command. On the other hand, wasting finished items to level a newbie enchanter seemed simply not worth the effort in the past. It changed with Auria Bell joining Minas Mar and the production of low-tier jewelry. Mary was currently looking for candidates to become enchanters for Minas Mar but had not found anyone yet. Blacksmith and sorceress entered the empty laboratories that had not seen any regular use for centuries. Al had only worked here for a while until she furbished her own place in the city. However, to change a formation, it was easiest to use the tools meant for the task. Although Seth didn't really understand the work of an enchanter, they also had crafting stations, and tools just like blacksmiths. Even when the sorceress was just walking around between writing complicated schematics on a magic board and an advanced version of an enchantment table, each and every move of hers was alluring. Swinging her hips with every step and shaking her sizable assets, being a honey trap was really a fundamental part of Al-Zalsar's existence. At least Seth had a good view while waiting an hour for Al to finish her work. As she had stated, it was no hard task and the people of could have done it just the same. They may have taken a little longer. Here, learn this. It's an enchantment to create a soul-whisking membrane. I adjusted the output based on the video you gave me. Although people may feel a little sick when passing through it, it can't banish the soul of anything stronger than an ordinary mouse. Will that really be enough? He asked. This seemed a little too weak in his opinion. It should be enough, but you can also call the princess and go test it. Those guys are more than able to make minor adjustments. Now then, let's finish our business. What followed was a full 2-hour-long lecture about the function of the ego defense system, how to control it, and how it refined Mithril to Ithildan. The ego defense system, or just ego, consisted of many formations distributed among the floating mountain peaks above and around Delta. Not only did it stabilize the islands, it also used them to create a self-sustaining net of attack magic and a barrier that could be activated when necessary. According to Al, it would be strong enough to even resist the attacks of a legendary existence like a dragon, although it may not be able to kill it. Not only was Seth able to use this expansive formation to refine Ithildan, the great sorceress had even left a backdoor in the interface. In ordinary times it would be controlled by a team of specialists employed by Delta. However, it also had an interface through which the tower ego of Minas Mar gained administrator access to the whole system. In the end, Al was always part of Minas Mar, even when working on a government project. I know you have to go, but I really wish you would not have to. There are still some things you have not told me and I'm sure we will have a hard time in the future, Seth said honestly, with regret in his voice. But he did not try to persuade her to stay. PFF, you are talking as if I wasn't going to return. You know. I also accepted this place as my home. Hearing that she planned to return cheered him up a little. To think that the over 200-year-old lich also had some attachment to them made him feel happy. So, when are you going to leave? Today. Today? Yes, I really pushed it back as far as I could. Seth took a deep breath and smiled. Fine, but I will be sad if you don't bring any souvenirs from fighting a dragon, okay? Ha! Just you wait. You will feel really silly for being happy about a handful of dragon scales when I haul back a whole corpse for you. I probably will. After bickering for a while, Alzalsar said her final farewell and really left. Seth sighed. Seeing her really leave made him feel a little empty inside, maybe even a little sad. It was already getting late and Seth didn't feel like going to the workshop now. With a big sigh, he flopped down on the sofa and turned on the TV. Just what he needed, some simple brainless distraction. He had been watching some old cartoon for an hour when Mina sat down beside him. She didn't speak, just cuddled up to him. She's really gone, isn't she? He finally let out. Wanna talk about it? His fiancée asked softly. They simply talked until late into the night. Not even about the sorceress all the time, they just talked about anything on their mind.